Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to settle into one of those ancient myths that's technically full of gods, lightning bolts, and divine ego wars, but don't worry, we're keeping it chill. No epic battles, no fiery deaths, and definitely no yelling. Just a calm drift through Olympus, where even the goddesses had to deal with the occasional workplace drama. So, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's float into the story of how Athena, yes, the famously sensible goddess of wisdom, found herself in a feud with the world's very first fashion designer. Because even in ancient Greece, there was always that one person who thought they could outsmart management. Our story begins not with Athena herself, but with a woman named Arachne. She was mortal, which already put her at a cosmic disadvantage. Because mortals in Greek myths have one consistent habit: they don't know when to stop talking, especially when it comes to bragging about themselves. Arachne was a weaver. Not just good, unreasonably good. The kind of good that makes people start whispering that maybe you've been getting divine tutoring on the side. In ancient Greece, this was not a compliment. It was a polite way of saying, you should probably stop before Zeus hears about this and turns you into furniture. But Arachne didn't stop. In fact, she leaned in. People would gather around to watch her at the loom, threads flying in perfect rhythm, colors blending like something pulled straight out of Olympus' interior design catalog. And when someone inevitably said, "Wow, your work is almost as good as Athena's," Arachne didn't even blink. She just said, "Almost?" That's the thing about mortals in these myths. They all have main character syndrome. Now, Athena, for all her divine intelligence, had a bit of a temper when mortals got uppity. She wasn't quite as vengeful as, say, Hera, who could hold a grudge longer than some empires lasted, but Athena had her pride. She was, after all, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, which means weaving was kind of her thing. So when word reached Olympus that a mortal woman was out here declaring herself the queen of textiles, Athena decided to pay a visit. But she didn't descend in full goddess glory. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she disguised herself as a harmless old lady, the kind who appears in every Greek myth right before things go downhill. She approached Arachne quietly, leaning on her staff, pretending to admire the work. "You're very talented," the old woman said, "but maybe it would be wise to give credit where it's due. Surely the goddess Athena guided your hand?" Arachne didn't even pause her weaving. "Guided me? I taught myself." You could almost hear the divine lightning charging up somewhere in the distance. Athena, still in disguise, tried again. "Child, pride is dangerous. Ask forgiveness, and the goddess will forgive your boldness." Arachne finally looked up, smirking. "If Athena thinks she's better than me, tell her to prove it." And that's when Athena decided she'd heard enough. With the calm inevitability of someone about to teach a lesson in the most dramatic way possible, the old woman vanished, replaced by Athena in all her armored, glowing, battle-helmeted glory. You can imagine the silence in that room. Threads probably stopped midair. Arachne, to her credit, didn't faint, didn't apologize, didn't even back away. She just shrugged and said, "All right then, let's weave." Now, if the gods had HR, this would be the moment someone from divine compliance stepped in and said, maybe this isn't appropriate. But alas, Olympus ran on chaos and ego. So, the contest began. Both women set up their looms, and the air filled with the soft rhythm of thread and shuttle. Athena's tapestry was, predictably, all about herself. She depicted the gods in their shining splendor, the heavens in perfect symmetry, and, just in case Arachne missed the message, a few smaller scenes showing mortals being punished for challenging the divine. Subtle. Arachne's approach, however, was different. She wove the same gods, but instead of showing them as noble beings of wisdom and justice, she portrayed their less flattering moments. Zeus disguising himself to chase mortal women, Poseidon throwing tantrums, Dionysus being, well, Dionysus. Basically, she created the ancient Greek equivalent of a tell-all celebrity documentary. The workmanship was flawless. The colors, unreal. Even Athena had to admit, silently of course, that Arachne's work was technically perfect. There were no mistakes to criticize. Which, for a goddess who prided herself on wisdom, was infuriating. So what did Athena do? She did what every divine being in Greek mythology does when they lose an argument. She snapped. Without a word, she struck the tapestry. The threads shimmered, the colors melted, and the whole thing dissolved into nothing. Then, because gods never stop at enough, she touched Arachne on the forehead. Instantly, the girl began to change. Her fingers shrank, her arms twisted, her skin stretched thin and fragile. A moment later, Arachne was gone, replaced by a small, trembling spider. Athena stared down at her creation, or punishment, and said something like, "Fine, keep weaving." And that, according to the myth, is how spiders were born. Which, if true, means every spider spinning a web in your ceiling corner tonight is just another Arachne descendant working quietly under Athena's eternal side-eye. Now, that's the myth as most of us know it. But as usual with Greek stories, there's more beneath the surface, like a badly buried scandal. Because Athena wasn't just the goddess of wisdom. She was also, technically, the patron of civilization, cities, laws, philosophy, and anything that made humans slightly less feral. Weaving wasn't just about art, it was about order. The loom represented the structured, rational world, threads crossing and interlocking in harmony. Arachne's defiance wasn't just arrogance. It was rebellion against divine order. She wasn't saying she was better than Athena, she was saying she didn't need Athena, which, in the Greek worldview, was basically heresy. Athena couldn't let that slide. Not because she was jealous, though, let's be honest, she absolutely was, but because the myth needed to remind everyone that humans should stay in their lane. It's like a cosmic workplace policy: never outperform your divine supervisor. Now, let's float for a moment to the deeper irony here. Athena, goddess of logic, strategy, and calm reasoning, could have simply ignored Arachne. She could have said, good for her. Humans need hobbies." But instead, she went full divine meltdown. The goddess who solved wars with clever diplomacy turned a weaver into an arachnid because she didn't like the Yelp review. It's one of those moments where you realize, even wisdom has a temper. Still, Greek myths weren't really about moral lessons. They were more like divine soap operas, each one featuring a slightly different reason why mortals shouldn't have opinions. And in that sense, Arachne's story fits perfectly. She became the eternal weaver, cursed to create endlessly, never celebrated, never finished. Which, if you've ever worked a creative job under bad management, probably sounds familiar. Athena herself was born from Zeus's head, literally. Full armor, no mother, straight out of divine migraine territory. She was the ultimate perfectionist, reason made flesh. But weaving was one of the few activities that showed her softer, more human side. It was the goddess at her calmest, creating beauty, not destruction. And then Arachne came along and basically said, "Cool art, but I could do it better." That single mortal moment, pride, confidence, maybe just poor timing, was enough to tilt the balance. It's almost funny, in a sleepy, philosophical way. Because if Athena really was wise, she should have admired Arachne. A true goddess of crafts would celebrate mastery wherever it appeared. But that's not how myths work. The gods didn't model good behavior. They modeled the unpredictable universe, beautiful, cruel, and occasionally petty. So tonight, as you drift off and maybe picture the quiet motion of a spider spinning in the corner of your room, remember that you're watching one of the oldest metaphors in the world. A thread connecting human pride to divine wrath, creativity to punishment, art to obsession. Arachne weaves not because she must, but because she can't stop. And Athena watches, still judging, still pretending she didn't lose that competition thousands of years ago. Because really, she kind of did. Let's float onward, then, to another Olympian ego crisis, one that starts with a golden apple, continues with a very bad wedding invitation list, and ends with the first ever mythological beauty contest. Because of course it does. Chapter 2, The Apple That Started a War. It all began, as so many bad ideas do, with a wedding invitation list. Now, you'd think the gods would be good at planning parties. After all, they had infinite time, infinite wine, and an entire staff of minor deities whose only job was to make things sparkle. But somehow, they still managed to turn a wedding into the mythological equivalent of an office brawl. The wedding in question was between Peleus, a mortal, technically, but one of those mortals who had enough divine connections to get away with it, and Thetis, a sea nymph. The gods adored her, except for Zeus, who had received a prophecy that any son she bore would become greater than his father. So naturally, he thought the best solution was to marry her off to someone mortal. Classic Zeus logic. And so the invitations went out. Everyone on Olympus was invited. Everyone except one goddess, Eris, the goddess of discord, which, honestly, feels like the kind of oversight that should have raised a few divine eyebrows. If you're throwing a wedding and there's literally a goddess named Discord, maybe invite her, just to be safe. But no, Eris was left off the list. And in true mythological fashion, she decided to RSVP anyway. So there they were, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, even Dionysus, who had already started drinking because of course he had. The music was playing, the ambrosia was flowing, everyone was pretending not to notice Zeus flirting with the bridesmaids. And then the air went cold. Eris appeared, uninvited, unbothered, and probably already regretting wearing black to a white-themed wedding. She didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't flip any tables. She just smiled, held up a small golden apple and said, "For the fairest." Then she tossed it into the crowd. That's it. That was her whole move. No speech, no fireworks, just one piece of fruit. But the thing about Olympus is, subtlety doesn't go over well. The apple landed between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. 3 goddesses, all beautiful, all competitive, and all immediately convinced that the apple was meant for them. And that, dear listener, is how an entire generation of heroes ended up dying at Troy. Because 3 women couldn't agree on fruit labeling. Zeus, as king of the gods, was asked to make the call. Who was the fairest? Now, Zeus might have been many things. Impulsive, unfaithful, addicted to lightning-based solutions, but he wasn't stupid. There was no safe answer to that question. Pick Hera and you anger Aphrodite. Pick Aphrodite and you get a permanent cold shoulder from your wife. Pick Athena and she'll probably write a whole thesis about your poor judgment. So Zeus did what all great leaders do when faced with a problem too dangerous to handle. He delegated. "Let's have someone else decide," he said, probably smiling too wide. "A mortal. They're impartial." And so he appointed Paris, a shepherd from Troy, to judge which goddess was the fairest. Now, Paris wasn't just any random shepherd. He was technically royal, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. But like many mythological infants, his early life had a small hiccup. A prophecy had warned that he would bring destruction to his city, so his parents did what ancient royalty always did when faced with inconvenient predictions. They abandoned the baby in the mountains. Paris survived, of course. A bear or maybe a shepherd found him. Accounts vary, and he grew up handsome, mild-tempered, and with a sort of doomed charisma that always spells trouble in Greek mythology. So there he was, tending sheep on Mount Ida, when 3 goddesses suddenly appeared before him, each demanding that he make the most politically dangerous decision in human history. Imagine the pressure. 1 minute you're minding your own business, counting sheep. The next, 3 divine beings are arguing over who's hottest. Hera went first. Always the politician. She offered Paris power. "Choose me," she said, "and I'll make you king of all men." Athena stepped forward next. Always strategic. "Choose me, and I'll give you wisdom and victory in war." And then Aphrodite. She didn't bother with speeches. She just smiled, leaned closer, and said, "Choose me, and I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world." You can probably guess how that went. Paris, being a young man with more charm than foresight, handed the apple to Aphrodite. And just like that, history, or mythological history at least, was doomed. Because the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, married to Menelaus, and apparently very open to divine matchmaking. Aphrodite kept her promise. She helped Paris and Helen meet, and the two fell for each other in the kind of vague, instant way only ancient myths and bad romance novels can pull off. Some say she went willingly. Others claim she was enchanted. Either way, she left Sparta and sailed off with Paris to Troy. When Menelaus found out, he did not take it well. He called his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, general overachiever, and man with a permanent grievance list. Together, they rallied the Greek kings to retrieve Helen. And so began the Trojan War. All because Eris wasn't invited to a wedding. Now, it's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it. An apple, a beauty contest, a shepherd making world-altering decisions. But the myth was never really about the war. It was about vanity, ego, and the gods' endless need for validation. The Greeks understood something quietly devastating. Beauty, like power, always demands a price. The apple wasn't a prize. It was bait. And everyone, gods, mortals, heroes, fell for it. Paris himself was a strange choice for divine judgment. He wasn't ambitious. He wasn't cruel. He was, in many ways, the perfect neutral party. But neutrality doesn't exist in Olympus. By choosing Aphrodite, he set himself against Hera and Athena, two goddesses who didn't exactly forgive and forget. During the war, Hera backed the Greeks. Athena did too. And Aphrodite, of course, protected Paris and the Trojans. The battlefield became a divine chessboard. Every sword swing had a celestial sponsor. And yet, for all the chaos that followed, Paris himself remained oddly passive. He fought occasionally, usually poorly, and mostly relied on divine intervention to survive. At one point, when he was losing a duel, Aphrodite literally whisked him off the field in a cloud of mist. Which is impressive, but not exactly heroic. He was, in essence, the man who caused the greatest war of the ancient world, and then kept trying to take naps during it. Meanwhile, Helen didn't exactly thrive in Troy. Depending on which poet you ask, she was either guilt-ridden or indifferent. Homer paints her as quietly melancholy, weaving scenes of the war into her tapestries, which, interestingly, brings us right back to Athena and Arachne. The act of weaving as storytelling, as memory, as quiet endurance. It's almost poetic. Arachne weaves in defiance, Helen in regret. Both women trapped in patterns they didn't fully choose. As for the gods, they treated the Trojan War like a group project gone wrong. Zeus kept pretending to stay neutral, which fooled no one. Ares switched sides depending on who annoyed him that week. Apollo backed Troy, but mostly for the drama. And Poseidon spent half the war complaining about payback from a completely different myth. The whole divine pantheon was involved, not because they cared about mortals, but because mortals were excellent pawns in their eternal family feuds. The Greeks didn't need Netflix. They had this. And in the middle of it all was that golden apple, still shining in memory. The tiny object that proved how fragile divine egos could be. It wasn't just an apple. It was proof that Olympus ran on insecurity. Because if you think about it, what kind of god needs external validation? You'd think immortality would be enough. But no. Even goddesses needed someone to say, "Yes, you're the prettiest." That's the quiet tragedy of the myth. Not the war, not the heroes who died, but the fragile vanity that started it all. The gods weren't cruel because they were evil. They were cruel because they were deeply human. And maybe that's why these stories still linger. They mirror us. Our need to be chosen. Our jealousy. Our pride. The apple still rolls, somewhere in the back of every story about beauty, power, or recognition. Always tempting, always glowing, always promising something we already have but can't quite believe. When the war finally ended, the gods drifted back to Olympus as if nothing had happened. Troy burned, heroes died, and somewhere in the ashes, a faint glimmer of gold might have still been there, the apple, untouched, waiting for the next argument. Because the gods never really learn. And neither do we. Let's float onward now to another quiet disaster. One involving a young musician, a tragic snake, and the goddess who couldn't resist meddling in art and love once again. Chapter 3. Orpheus and the world's worst rescue attempt. The thing about Greek myths is that even the musicians can't catch a break. Orpheus was supposed to be one of the lucky ones. His mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and his father, depending on which version you believe, was either a Thracian king or Apollo himself. Either way, it meant Orpheus grew up in a family where art wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. By all accounts, he was the greatest musician who ever lived. When he played, rivers paused. Trees leaned closer. Wild animals stopped fighting just to listen. Basically, he was ancient Greece's version of a one-man spa playlist. If Spotify had existed back then, his chill lute vibes channel would have been #1. He eventually fell in love with a nymph named Eurydice. She was quiet, graceful, and apparently had the personality of a misty forest morning. The two married, and for a brief, shining moment, everything was actually fine. Which, as we know, in Greek mythology is never a good sign, because the gods can't stand happy couples. It's like they have divine allergies to stable relationships. One day, Eurydice went for a walk through the fields, barefoot, probably humming something pastoral, when she stepped on a snake. The snake, being a snake, bit her. She died almost instantly. No thunderbolts, no curses, no epic betrayal. Just a snake. And so, Orpheus did what any artist would do when the universe stole his muse. He started playing sad music about it. But his grief didn't stop there. Orpheus decided to do something no mortal had ever attempted before: go to the underworld and bring her back. Now, the underworld wasn't exactly a tourist destination. Most souls didn't even get a proper map. You died, you drifted down, and if you were lucky, someone buried you with a coin so you could pay Sharon, the skeletal ferryman who had exactly one facial expression and 0 customer service patience. But Orpheus didn't need to die to get in. He just walked, lyre in hand, and kept playing. His music softened even the coldest guardians. The gates opened not because of power or permission, but because no one could stand to interrupt the melody. Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who normally treated trespassers like chew toys, reportedly just sat down and listened, tails wagging in perfect 3/4 rhythm. Orpheus played through the caverns of Hades, and the shades, those pale, restless souls, paused their endless wandering. Even the Furies, who specialized in screaming, grew quiet. And eventually, he reached the throne of Hades and Persephone. Now, Hades gets a bad reputation. He wasn't cruel, just tired. He had one job: manage the dead. No scandals, no parties, no lightning bolts. Just paperwork, all day, every day, for eternity. Persephone, for her part, had been dragged into this marriage and made the best of it, which honestly makes her one of the more relatable figures in mythology. So when Orpheus appeared before them, all pale devotion and trembling hands, they didn't get angry. They listened. He played his lyre. No words, no begging, just sound. Low, winding, mournful. The song of someone trying to unmake death itself. And it worked. The entire underworld wept. Even the rivers, black, silent, eternal, slowed. Persephone leaned against her husband's shoulder and whispered, "Let him have her." Hades sighed, the kind of sigh you only hear from someone who's been married for millennia, and said, "Fine. But there's a rule. There's always a rule. Eurydice could return to the living world. But only if Orpheus led her out without looking back. Not once. If he turned, she'd be gone forever. Simple. But not easy. So they began the climb. Through the caverns of shadow, up through the dim tunnels of stone and mist. Orpheus walked ahead, his lyre glowing faintly, its sound echoing off unseen walls. Behind him, he could hear the soft whisper of Eurydice's steps, distant, almost weightless. He didn't speak, didn't look, just kept moving. The silence stretched. The air grew thinner, lighter. A faint breeze brushed his face, the first sign of life, sunlight, freedom. He was almost there. Because that's how these things go. He couldn't hear her anymore. Just the faint echo of his own footsteps. The light was ahead, so close he could see the outline of the upper world. But what if she wasn't there? What if the gods were tricking him? It's easy to say he should have trusted. But remember, Orpheus was a musician. His whole existence depended on hearing, on feedback, on resonance. Silence was unbearable. So he turned. And in that instant, she faded. No scream. No dramatic collapse. Just a soft shimmer, and she was gone. He reached for her, but there was nothing. The echo of her name bounced off the stone walls and disappeared. Orpheus stumbled forward, out into the living world, alone. He tried to go back. Of course he did. But the gates of the underworld don't open twice. Not for mortals. So he wandered, played his songs, filled forests with the sound of heartbreak until even the trees probably started rolling their eyes. Eventually, he swore off all human company. Some say he turned to teaching. Others say he simply sat by a river, playing endlessly, until his own body forgot how to live. There's a version where he's torn apart by the Maenads, frenzied followers of Dionysus, who grew jealous of his music. Another where he simply fades. Like Eurydice. Either way, he ends up back in the underworld, reunited at last. The poets love that ending, tragic, tidy, vaguely romantic. But it's also kind of funny in a grim, Greek way. He went to hell and back for love, failed because of self-doubt, and then died doing the one thing he was good at, making everyone sad. Of course, scholars love to overthink this one. They say the story isn't about love at all, it's about art. About the futility of trying to reverse loss. About the human need to create something that fights death, even though it never really wins. Which sounds profound until you realize it's also just a cautionary tale about listening to instructions. Still, there's something quietly haunting about it. Because we've all been Orpheus, in some small way, walking forward, terrified to look back, hoping what we love is still following behind. That soft tension between trust and fear, between music and silence, between creation and the void. In ancient Greece, Orpheus became more than a man. He became a symbol, a kind of mythological patron saint for every artist who ever tried to capture something fleeting. Poets wrote hymns to him. Philosophers compared his descent to the search for truth. Even mystery cults sprang up around his name, Orphic rituals promising insight into life, death, and whatever lies between. Ironically, none of those followers ever agreed on what he actually stood for. But that's art for you. Everyone hears the same song. Everyone feels something different. There's also a lesser-known detail in some ancient accounts, that when Orpheus played in the underworld, even Athena paused her work to listen. The goddess of wisdom, unmoved by flattery or prayer, reportedly lowered her spear and said, "That is knowledge too." Which might just be a poetic way of saying even logic needs beauty sometimes. Or maybe it's a reminder that the gods, for all their power, couldn't create what mortals could, the fragile, temporary art that only matters because it ends. And so Orpheus, the world's first tragic musician, became the eternal echo. His lyre, according to myth, was taken up into the stars by the muses. You can still see it there, the constellation Lyra, faint but steady, hovering quietly above the sleeping world. It's comforting in a way, because somewhere in that soft starlight, the song still plays. And maybe, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear him still calling for Eurydice, not out of grief anymore, but memory. The kind of love that finally stopped asking to be returned. Let's drift onward, then to a lighter, though no less absurd, chapter of divine meddling. This one involves a sculptor, a marble woman, and a goddess who decided to grant a wish far too literally. Chapter 4. Pygmalion and the goddess who granted the wrong wish. Some myths are about war and some are about love. And then there are the ones that sound suspiciously like someone needed therapy but got divine intervention instead. This is one of those. Pygmalion was a sculptor from Cyprus. Which already tells you a lot, because in ancient mythology, people from islands tended to make bad decisions surrounded by beautiful scenery. He was rich, talented, and apparently very handsome in that brooding artisan who doesn't talk to anyone way. The kind of man who would, today, own too many candles and say things like, "I'm not lonely, I'm selective." His art was flawless. He carved gods, heroes, nymphs, all out of marble so smooth it supposedly felt like skin. People traveled from across the Aegean just to watch him work. But beneath all that talent, there was an issue. Pygmalion didn't actually like people. Especially not women. You see, in his time, Cyprus was home to a group of women who, depending on which ancient source you read, either rejected the worship of Aphrodite or just generally behaved in ways the goddess didn't approve of. Aphrodite, Being the sensitive soul she was, cursed them all, making them unworthy of love. Pygmalion saw this and decided that human women were too flawed altogether. Too vain, too loud, too emotional. Basically, he read one bad scroll and declared himself above relationships. So, like any man who believed no one was good enough for him, he made his own. Out of marble. She was perfect. Or at least, perfect by his definition. Silent, beautiful, obedient, and literally incapable of having opinions. He named her Galatea, though some versions don't give her a name at all. Which feels fitting, considering Pygmalion didn't want a partner. He wanted a statue that reflected his own ideal. He worked for months, shaping her features, smoothing every curve, refining every detail. When he was done, she wasn't just art, she was obsession. He dressed her in fine robes, gave her jewelry, brought her flowers that would wither beside her stillness. He kissed her cold lips and pretended not to notice the chill. And when people asked why he never married, he just smiled and said he already had perfection, which is both poetic and deeply concerning. Eventually, Pygmalion did what all ancient artists do when they've run out of healthy coping mechanisms. He prayed. He went to the temple of Aphrodite and made an offering. Some say it was incense. Others say it was a small ivory statue, a miniature of Galatea herself. He didn't dare say her name. He just whispered that he wanted a wife like his statue. Aphrodite, who had probably seen far stranger requests, decided to take this one literally. She didn't say anything, didn't even appear in a puff of golden mist. The goddess simply watched, smiled that knowing, mischievous smile, and quietly granted the wish. That night, Pygmalion returned home. The room was dim, the marble gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He touched the statue's hand, as he always did, and for a moment, it felt different. He froze. The stone softened beneath his fingers, pulsing faintly with life. Her skin, once cold as the chisel's edge, blushed like sunrise. The statue moved, slowly, gently, like someone waking from a long, silent dream. And just like that, Galatea was alive. Pygmalion fell to his knees, probably crying, possibly panicking. It's hard to say. The ancient poets were very selective about emotional realism. He thanked Aphrodite, of course. She appeared briefly, radiant and smug, to give her blessing. And then she left, probably muttering something about men who can't handle real women. Now, the story ends, officially, with a happily ever after. Galatea became Pygmalion's wife. They had a son, and everyone lived in marble-free domestic bliss. But you can't help wondering what that actually looked like. Imagine waking up one day as a statue. No memories, no past, just someone telling you, "Hi, I'm the guy who built you. We're married now." Even in a myth, that's awkward. Some later writers tried to fill in the gaps. They said Galatea learned quickly, curious and kind. That she loved her maker sincerely. That she brought warmth into his cold, chiseled world. Others hinted it wasn't that simple. That Pygmalion, who had spent so long idealizing her perfection, struggled to handle her humanity. Because the thing about perfection is, it doesn't talk back. And real people do. Modern readers often call this story romantic. But if you listen closely, it's more like a warning. It's not about love conquering art. It's about art refusing to coexist with reality. Pygmalion fell in love with an idea. And Aphrodite, in one of her more ironic moods, made that idea real, just to see what he'd do. She didn't punish him. She gave him exactly what he asked for. And sometimes, that's the cruelest kind of divine justice. The myth has survived in endless retellings. Playwrights, painters, poets, all fascinated by that frozen moment when stone turns to flesh. It's been interpreted as the triumph of art over nature, or of love over loneliness, or of male ego over common sense. In truth, it's probably all three, because Greek myths never draw clear moral lines. They just lay out human contradictions like an artist's sketches, half finished, half erased. Pygmalion's story isn't tragic because he created life. It's tragic because he didn't know what to do with it afterward. There's one version, a late Roman retelling, that adds a small, beautiful detail. When Galatea awakens, the first thing she does isn't speak. She reaches out, gently touches Pygmalion's face, and wipes a tear away. It's as if she already understands the sadness that shaped her. Because in the end, she wasn't born from desire or even love. She was born from loneliness sculpted into form. And that makes her one of the quietest, most haunting figures in mythology. A woman who began as silence, and kept it even when she could finally speak. Of course, Aphrodite walked away from the whole situation completely satisfied. Her lesson was simple: love isn't meant to be carved. It's messy, inconvenient, and occasionally infuriating. You can't sculpt perfection into being. You can only meet it, by accident, and hope it doesn't run away when you start talking. Centuries later, philosophers would use Pygmalion as a metaphor for idealism. Psychologists would call it projection. Teachers would turn it into a theory about expectations shaping outcomes. But underneath all that analysis, there's still the same sleepy myth of a lonely man, a statue that learned to breathe, and a goddess with a sense of humor so dry it could powder marble. In the quiet after, when the temple lamps burned low and the waves of Cyprus whispered against the shore, you can almost imagine Galatea standing at the window, watching the stars, touching her own skin, maybe wondering what it meant to be alive because someone wanted you to be. Maybe grateful, maybe uneasy, maybe both. And somewhere, Aphrodite would smile, knowing that love, once again, had made a mess of art. Let's drift now to another myth where creation gets complicated. A craftsman who built wings, a boy who flew too close, and a son that didn't care either way. Chapter 5. Daedalus and the boy who wouldn't listen. Some stories are tragic. Some are inspiring. And then there's the story of Daedalus, which is mostly just a long sigh followed by, of course that went wrong. He was Athens' greatest craftsman, an inventor, sculptor, engineer, basically the ancient Greek version of that one uncle who can fix anything but should never be left unsupervised with power tools. Daedalus built wonders, mechanical statues that moved on their own, temples so intricate that even the priests got lost. He was brilliant and a little too proud of it, because in the ancient world, being too good at something was dangerous. The gods didn't like competition, neither did kings, and Daedalus was about to annoy both. The trouble began, as many Greek troubles do, in Crete, that sun-baked island where myths go to get tangled. King Minos ruled there. You might remember him as the guy with the labyrinth and the monster problem. He was rich, stubborn, and perpetually angry about something. He hired Daedalus to build him a few small projects, some palaces, a mechanical bull suit, and, later, a maze so complicated even Google Maps would have refused to render it. We'll get to the maze in a second. But first, the bull suit. Because yes, that was a real thing. Here's the backstory, and it's uncomfortable. Minos once prayed to Poseidon for a perfect bull, a white, shining animal to prove the gods favored him. Poseidon obliged, sending one from the sea. But Minos liked the bull so much that he kept it for himself instead of sacrificing it as promised. Classic Minos. Poseidon, being predictably petty, cursed Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull. Daedalus was then asked to help, which is a polite way of saying, build a contraption that would allow this poor queen to carry out her divinely induced obsession. He didn't ask questions. He just built a hollow wooden cow, realistic enough to fool an actual bull. And thus, mythology's strangest engineering project was completed. The result of that union, yes, we're still talking about it, was the Minotaur. Half man, half bull, fully unmanageable. Minos was horrified, obviously, and immediately needed a place to hide the evidence. So he asked Daedalus to build a labyrinth. And what a labyrinth it was! Corridors that twisted back on themselves, doorways that led nowhere, chambers echoing with dead ends. It was a masterpiece of confusion. Only Daedalus himself understood its design, which, as it turned out, was another problem, because Minos wasn't the kind of king who liked witnesses. Once the Minotaur was safely locked away, Daedalus and his son Icarus were imprisoned too, in a tower, so they couldn't share the secret. It's worth noting that this was probably the least efficient way to thank your architect. But Minos was never known for his HR policies. Daedalus did what all great inventors do when locked in a tower. He started building things. He studied the birds that circled the cliffs and decided that if nature could fly, so could he. Over time, he gathered feathers, small, large, discarded, scavenged from the sea breeze, and bound them with wax. Slowly, he built 2 sets of wings. One for himself, one for Icarus. They tested them in secret. The old man, cautious. The boy, thrilled. You can almost picture it. Feathers catching the morning light, wax glistening, Daedalus whispering, "Stay close. Don't fly too high." And here's where mythology becomes parenting advice disguised as physics. Daedalus warned Icarus about 2 things. Don't fly too high, or the sun will melt the wax. Don't fly too low, or the sea's mist will weigh you down. Just the right height. That's the balance of wisdom. Icarus nodded. Probably didn't listen. Because he was young, reckless, and born in a story where ignoring advice is the whole point. When the wind was right, they jumped. The guards below must have stared in disbelief. 2 figures rising from the cliffs, wings wide, shadows flickering across the sea. Daedalus soared easily, steady, cautious. He turned, checking on his son. But Icarus, oh Icarus, felt freedom for the first time. Real, open, terrifying freedom. The air rushed around him, the world shrinking beneath his feet. He laughed. He climbed higher. The sun glared above him, beautiful, golden, fatal. And you know what happens next. The wax softened. Feathers loosened. The air, once holding him up, turned cold and empty. He fell. No drama, no thunder, just silence and sea spray. Daedalus watched helpless. He flew down as far as the waves would let him, calling his son's name until his voice broke. He found the feathers drifting on the surface, small, white, shining in the sun. He gathered them, piece by piece, and named the sea the Icarian, so the world would remember. Then he flew on alone, silent, heavy with the kind of sorrow that builds slowly and never leaves. Later, Daedalus found refuge in Sicily. King Caucasus welcomed him, impressed by his inventions. Minos, of course, hunted him down. The king brought a puzzle, a seashell with a thread running through it, and challenged anyone to solve it. Only Daedalus could. He tied the thread to an ant, which crawled through the spiral carrying it end to end. Minos knew instantly where his fugitive craftsman was hiding. He came to Sicily demanding Daedalus's return. Caucasus pretended to agree, then had Minos drowned in a bath. And that was the end of that. You'd think Daedalus might retire after all that. But no, he kept inventing, building, creating, because that's what he did. That's what he was. He had outlived his masterpiece, his crime, his son, and his king. The rest was just working quietly. The myths don't say whether he ever flew again. But they say he built statues so lifelike they needed to be chained down, lest they walk away. And maybe that's how he kept Icarus close, by crafting shapes that couldn't fall. The Greeks, of course, took the story and turned it into a metaphor. They were good at that. Daedalus became the wise craftsman, punished for genius. Icarus, the arrogant dreamer who flew too close. But maybe it's not really about arrogance at all. Maybe it's just about the tragedy of wanting too much freedom too soon. Every parent who's ever watched their child run ahead and vanish around a corner knows that feeling. That helpless, sinking awareness that love can't hold wings in place. There's a gentle irony here. Daedalus spent his life escaping traps, royal ones, divine ones, even ones of his own design. But the one trap he couldn't escape was grief. That's the quiet punishment the gods prefer. No lightning bolts. Just the silence after someone's laughter is gone. Still, you have to admire him. He built a way out of stone and sky. He turned feathers and wax into rebellion. And even if it ended the way all Greek experiments do, tragically, there's something quietly beautiful about it. It's what humans do best. Look up, build something impossible, and hope for the best. In the end, Daedalus's name became synonymous with cleverness. But if you listen closely, the myth sounds more like a lullaby about limits. Too high, and the wax melts. Too low, and the waves drag you under. Somewhere in between, that's life. The story of Daedalus and Icarus has been painted, rewritten, and analyzed for centuries. But the old poets said it best. The father who invented flight lost his son to the very sky he dreamed of, which feels like the most human thing imaginable. And, of course, very Greek. Let's drift quietly from the winds of invention to something softer. Another god's obsession with beauty, and a mortal who just wanted to be left alone by her reflection. Chapter 6. Narcissus and the mirror pool that didn't care. Some myths are warnings. Some are lessons. And some are just very long ways of saying, he should have looked away. This one is about Narcissus, the original pretty boy of Greek mythology. A man so stunning that even the nymphs couldn't form coherent sentences around him. And unfortunately, a man with the personality of a particularly smug statue. Let's float back to his beginning. He was the son of the river god Cephissus and the nymph Liriope, which already set him up for an identity crisis. Half flowing water, half flower field, entirely unprepared for self-awareness. The story goes that when Narcissus was born, his mother did what all mothers in Greek myths do. She found a prophet and demanded spoilers. The prophet was Tiresias, the one who somehow managed to be both male and female, blind yet all-seeing, and perpetually exasperated by everyone's choices. Liriope asked if her son would live a long life. Tiresias replied, very cryptically, yes, if he never knows himself. Which, in Greek myth terms, is basically the universe saying, we've already written this ending. Narcissus grew into the kind of man poets liked to describe in too much detail. Skin like sunlight on marble, hair that apparently had its own PR agent, and a face so symmetrical it probably broke hearts at 50 feet. He knew he was beautiful, and he behaved like someone who did. He rejected everyone. Nymphs, mortals, even men who worshipped him openly. He didn't just say no, he said it with a level of disdain that probably echoed. He didn't need anyone. He had himself. And yes, you can already see where this is going. Among the many hearts he trampled was one belonging to Echo, a mountain nymph cursed by Hera to only repeat the last words spoken to her. It's a little poetic, really. A woman who could never start a conversation fell in love with someone who never listened. Echo followed Narcissus everywhere, hiding in the trees, whispering his own words back to him. When he finally noticed, she stepped forward, shy, trembling, trying to embrace him. He pushed her away, told her he'd rather die than love her. She faded after that. Literally. Her body wasting away until only her voice remained. The first ghost made of sound. But she wasn't the only one watching. Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, had seen enough. And she was not in the mood for pretty mortals with bad manners. So she did what all divine beings in Greek myths do when they want to teach a lesson. She set up a trap disguised as poetic irony. One afternoon, Narcissus wandered through the forest, thirsty and smug as ever. Nemesis led him to a secluded pool, perfectly still, perfectly clear. He leaned down to drink, and that's when he saw it. The reflection. He froze. It wasn't just his face he saw, it was perfection itself. Eyes like liquid bronze. Lips curved in quiet arrogance. Every feature softened by waterlight. He fell in love instantly. He didn't know it was himself. He didn't care. He only knew that the image in the pool was flawless, and it was looking back. So he stayed. At first, it was innocent. He talked to the reflection, smiled at it, tried to touch it. Each time, the water rippled, distorting the face, and he panicked, thinking he'd lost it. He begged it to come closer, to rise from the pool, to love him back. But of course, the water gave no answer. It only mirrored him, endlessly, patiently, cruelly. Days passed. He forgot to eat, to sleep, to move. He stayed beside the pool, entranced, whispering to the image, watching the sunlight shift across his own features. And slowly, inevitably, he began to fade. Some versions say he realized the truth at the end, that the beauty he adored was his own. Others say he never did, dying blissfully unaware that his lover was just light and water. Either way, he wasted away by the pool. His body vanished, leaving only a flower, the narcissus, blooming in his place. It's a short story, deceptively simple. But the Greeks rarely told simple stories. Because underneath all that mythic shimmer, Narcissus isn't just about vanity. It's about identity. What happens when you mistake your reflection for connection? When admiration replaces affection? When you stare so long at yourself that the world disappears? Tiresias's prophecy, of course, came true. Narcissus knew himself, but only as an image, not as a person. That's the irony. He never actually saw himself. He saw what he wanted to be, flawless, eternal, untouchable, and the reflection agreed. It always does. If you visit ancient texts, the tone varies. Some poets mock him. Others pity him. A few even turn him into a tragic romantic figure, the man who fell in love with the impossible. But the moral, if there is one, remains blurry. Maybe it's, don't be vain. Or maybe, don't trust still water. Or maybe, and this feels more Greek, that love, no matter how beautiful, destroys you if it can't be shared. Echo's presence in the myth lingers like a whisper behind him. She's the opposite of Narcissus, someone who can only repeat others, while he only ever heard himself. Two forms of silence circling each other. Her voice, even after she faded, would still echo through the valleys, repeating fragments of Narcissus's last words, "Farewell, my love." And the mountains would throw it back, again and again, long after both were gone. Later poets softened the myth. They said that when Narcissus died, Echo's voice grew gentler, no longer pained, just wistful. As if she forgave him. Maybe she did. After all, she was cursed to echo love forever. And he was cursed to love what could never answer. Between them, they created one of mythology's quietest tragedies. No wars, no monsters, no divine lightning. Just a boy, a reflection, and a voice fading into nothing. It's funny, in a dry, mythic way. The gods punished Narcissus not by destroying his beauty, but by letting him see it perfectly, until it consumed him. That's a very Greek solution. Why strike someone down when you can just let their own obsession do the work? The Romans, naturally, added a few embellishments. Ovid, ever the dramatic poet, described Narcissus gazing into the water, whispering, "Now I know what others have suffered for me." And for a moment, a brief, human moment, he felt remorse. Then the reflection smiled and it was gone. The Narcissus flower, delicate and pale, became a symbol of self-absorption, yes, but also of grief. Because it bends toward the water, as if still searching for something it lost. It's not a vain bloom. It's a mourning one. If you stretch the metaphor a little, you can even hear a faint echo of the myth in every mirror. Every time someone stares too long, fixes a detail, rehearses a smile, that's Narcissus, still trying to touch his own image. And every time a voice repeats in an empty room, that's Echo, still trying to be heard. Myths never really end. They just get quieter. As for Nemesis, she probably walked away satisfied. Another mortal lesson delivered. Another case file closed. Because her job was balance. And in a world where people loved themselves more than others, balance always meant loss. So Narcissus remains, not as a warning against vanity, but against loneliness disguised as love. He wanted connection but could only find reflection. He wanted beauty but could only see his own. He wanted eternity, and got it, in the form of a flower that blooms by every silent pool. And if you listen carefully, in some versions, Echo still lingers there, whispering back to him through the reeds, repeating his last gentle words to the water, "Farewell, my love, farewell, my love," until the ripples fade and the pool is still again. Chapter 7. Medusa, the makeover that went horribly, horribly right. There are a lot of tragic figures in Greek mythology. And then there's Medusa, who didn't even get a chance to be tragic before everyone decided she was a monster. Which is impressive, really. It takes a special kind of myth to ruin someone's life and their haircut in one divine act of spite. Let's settle in and untangle this one slowly. Medusa began as a mortal woman. Beautiful, yes, because that's how all of these stories start. She was one of 3 sisters known as the Gorgons, though the other 2 were immortal. Medusa, however, was the odd one out, mortal, gentle, and frankly just trying to mind her own business in a world where gods had no concept of boundaries. She served in Athena's temple. That meant vows of chastity, silence, and general avoidance of anything that might offend a goddess of reason. Which makes what happened next predictably ironic. Poseidon, the sea god, perpetually in competition with Athena, noticed Medusa. And when Greek gods noticed mortals, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Depending on which version you read, Poseidon seduced or attacked her inside Athena's temple. Either way, it wasn't mutual and it certainly wasn't subtle. The sea god got what he wanted. Then he left. Athena returned, saw the desecrated temple, and, instead of directing her rage at Poseidon, turned it all toward Medusa. Because apparently, in ancient mythology, divine logic was an optional feature. Athena transformed her. Her hair became a nest of living snakes. Her skin turned pale as stone. Her eyes, bright, wild, furious, gained a power so terrible that anyone who looked into them would turn to stone. It was, technically, a punishment, but also, strangely, a protection. Because from that day on, no one could ever touch Medusa again. Not kings. Not gods. Not anyone. Athena might not have realized it, but she'd created something far more complicated than a monster. Medusa fled to the far edge of the world, or at least what the Greeks imagined the edge to be. A lonely place of cliffs and sea winds, where even the birds didn't linger. She lived there quietly, surrounded by statues that had once been soldiers, adventurers, and the occasional unlucky fisherman. Most of them had come to kill her for glory. None had succeeded. It's easy to picture her there, silent, still, half human, half legend. The snakes whispering softly, her eyes heavy with the weight of being seen only as danger. The world, of course, couldn't leave her alone. Heroes always needed something to kill. Enter Perseus, a young demigod with questionable guidance and an excess of confidence. He was sent to bring back Medusa's head as a wedding gift for a local king, which already sets the tone. Athena herself, ironically, helped him, gave him a polished bronze shield to use as a mirror so he wouldn't have to look directly at Medusa. Hermes lent him winged sandals. Hades loaned him an invisibility helmet. And thus equipped, Perseus went monster hunting, with more divine gear than actual moral clarity. He found Medusa sleeping. The poets always linger here, describing how peaceful she looked, the snakes coiled softly, her breathing steady. It's an image that doesn't fit the monster reputation. Perseus crept closer, using the shield to guide his steps. And then, with one quick stroke, he severed her head. The snakes hissed. The air trembled. From her blood, Pegasus, the winged horse, burst forth, followed by a giant named Chrysor. Because apparently, in mythology, decapitation is just another form of birth. Perseus took the head, carefully wrapped it, and flew away. Medusa's story should end there, but her presence lingers through half the myths that follow. Her head became a weapon, the ultimate deterrent. Perseus used it to turn enemies to stone, even accidentally petrifying his future father-in-law. Athena eventually took the head and placed it on her shield, the Aegis, as both trophy and warning, which is an odd kind of tribute. Imagine being punished by a goddess, then becoming her permanent accessory. Still, there's something quietly powerful in it. Medusa, once cursed, now literally stared down Athena's enemies for eternity. Over time, the image of Medusa evolved. In early Greek art, she's monstrous, fanged, wide-eyed, tongue-lolling. But in later centuries, her face softens. She becomes tragic, beautiful even. By the classical period, sculptors were depicting her with melancholy calm, as if everyone finally realized she'd been punished for surviving. There's something deeply ironic in her myth. Athena, goddess of wisdom, punishes a woman for being violated. Then later, uses that woman's image to protect herself. It's not just cruel, it's self-contradictory. But Greek myths often work that way. They don't seek justice. They mirror reality, where power decides who deserves sympathy and survival is rebranded as monstrosity. Medusa's name eventually became shorthand for danger. Gorgon meant something terrifying, unapproachable. But if you strip away the divine pettiness, she's really just a symbol of boundaries. Touch me and turn to stone. It's not evil, it's self-defense. Later poets, mostly men, tried to fix her story. They romanticized it, made it about beauty gone wrong. But none of those retellings quite erase the quiet truth. Medusa was not the villain. She was the consequence. And in a mythology obsessed with power, consequences are always called monsters. You can almost imagine her last thoughts, just before the sword fell. Not fear, not rage, just exhaustion. The kind that comes from being hunted for things beyond your control. The sea whined through her snakes. The whisper of waves below. The quiet knowledge that she would finally be free, though not in the way she deserved. Perseus flew off a hero. Athena wore her image as armor. But the world still whispered her name in half fear, half reverence. Even now, her face endures on ancient shields, coins, statues. The eternal reminder that beauty and danger are often the same thing, depending on who's holding the mirror. The modern world calls her a feminist icon, which is poetic justice several thousand years late. But even without the reinterpretation, her myth has always hummed with quiet defiance. She never asked for revenge. She just existed. And that was terrifying enough. Maybe that's why her story still feels strangely peaceful beneath the tragedy. She didn't rise against Olympus. She didn't plead with the gods. She just stood there, untouchable. For a woman cursed by power, that's almost a victory. And Athena? Well, the goddess of reason had her logic, twisted as it was. Maybe, deep down, she saw something of herself in Medusa. A woman defined by intelligence and control, watching another woman punished for losing both. So she kept the head close. A reminder, perhaps, that wisdom and cruelty often share the same temple. If you close your eyes and imagine her, not the monster, but the woman, you can almost see her standing by the cliffs again. Hair alive, eyes glowing faintly, the sea stretching endlessly before her. Not angry anymore, just still. Because even stone eventually learns to rest. Chapter 8. Hera, Zeus, and the cow that wasn't a cow. If there's one thing you can rely on in Greek mythology, it's Zeus making bad romantic decisions. And Hera, his wife, making them worse. Their marriage was like an endless divine soap opera, heavy on thunder, light on self-awareness. Tonight's story features both of them, plus one very unlucky mortal named Io. And yes, she turns into a cow. Because apparently, ancient myths believed that if you ran out of ideas, the solution was add livestock. Io was a priestess of Hera, which, in hindsight, might have been her first mistake. She was young, pious, and, as the poets love to emphasize, beautiful, which is basically a curse in any Greek myth involving Zeus. Because the king of gods had a wandering eye. Actually, both of his eyes wandered constantly, usually toward the nearest mortal woman who made the mistake of existing attractively. So naturally, Zeus noticed Io. And from that moment on, her peace and safety were doomed. Now, you might imagine that the supreme god of Olympus could pursue romance with a little dignity. But no, Zeus's idea of courtship usually involved disguises, clouds, animals, or all three. And this time, he went with a dense white mist that blanketed the entire countryside, a classic move for concealing bad intentions. Through that fog, he approached Io. The myths are vague about what exactly happened, but let's just say Zeus was persuasive, and Io ended up caught in a situation that no priestess of Hera wanted to explain. Because Hera, goddess of marriage, vengeance, and general fury, had excellent divine intuition. She sensed something was off. She descended from Olympus immediately, and Zeus, caught red-handed, panicked. Now, Zeus's version of problem-solving was creative. To protect Io, he instantly turned her into a cow. A real one. Hooves, tail, the whole package. Imagine being Io, minding your business, serving in the temple one day, and suddenly being a bewildered bovine trying to remember your last human thought. It's hard to know what's worse, being transformed against your will or realizing your godly seducer just downgraded you to farm equipment to hide the evidence. Hera, of course, wasn't fooled. She arrived, looked around the suspiciously foggy meadow, and immediately spotted a very nervous-looking cow with unusually intelligent eyes. Zeus tried to play it off. "Oh, that cow? Just a random animal," he probably said, in the divine equivalent of sweating profusely. Hera smiled, that slow, terrifying kind of smile only long-married goddesses can manage. She said she loved the cow, adored it actually, and then, because Hera was nothing if not thorough, she asked Zeus if she could have it as a gift. Trapped Zeus said yes, which meant Io, still very much conscious and now mooing in panic, became Hera's new pet. This was not, as you might imagine, an easy life. Hera placed Io under the watch of Argus Panoptes, the giant with 100 eyes. Because apparently, having one guard with normal vision wasn't enough. Argus never truly slept. He just rested some eyes while others stayed open. He tied Io to an olive tree and kept constant watch. The poor girl wandered slowly, grazing half-heartedly, tormented by flies and divine humiliation. She could still think like a human, remember her family, her temple duties, her life. But she could no longer speak, only low and weep softly into the grass. Zeus, meanwhile, couldn't stand to see his latest mistake suffer, mostly because it made him look bad. So he sent Hermes to fix the situation. Now, Hermes was the god of travelers, thieves, and creative problem-solving. He arrived at Argus's post disguised as a shepherd, playing a flute. He played for hours, then told stories, then played again. One by one, Argus's eyes began to close. Eventually, all 100 shut, and Hermes, being efficient, if not exactly gentle, killed him. Hera found out, of course. She mourned Argus, then commemorated him by placing his eyes on her sacred bird, the peacock, which is why, to this day, peacocks have those shimmering eyes on their feathers. It's one of those charming details that make Greek mythology sound poetic until you remember it's built on divine manslaughter. Freed from Argus, Io should have been safe, but Hera wasn't finished. She sent a gadfly to torment Io, a stinging, relentless insect that followed her everywhere. Io ran, desperate to escape the pain, wandering across the earth in a kind of divine exile. She crossed mountains, rivers, and entire continents. She swam through the Ionian Sea, which, in a rare moment of mythic geography, actually got its name from her. She fled through Asia, then into Egypt, where her story finally found a kind of tired peace. By the time Io reached the Nile, she was half mad with exhaustion. Zeus, feeling vaguely guilty, finally begged Hera to end the torment. Hera, in a rare mood of semi-mercy, agreed, on the condition that Io never returned to Greece. So Zeus restored her human form. Io, still trembling from years of wandering, settled in Egypt, where she became revered as the goddess Isis, or at least merged into her mythology. She bore a son named Epiphus, who would go on to found dynasties, build cities, and generally do all the heroic things expected of children born from divine disaster. And that was that. Io, once a devoted priestess, became a goddess by accident. Zeus returned to Olympus, unpunished as always. And Hera probably waited about 3 days before finding another reason to be angry at him. The story doesn't sound particularly romantic or heroic. But that's the strange beauty of these old myths. They weren't written to make sense. They were written to explain, to patch the holes in the world with stories about gods behaving just like people, only louder and with better lighting. The Io myth explained why the Ionian Sea had its name, why peacocks have eyes on their feathers, and maybe, unintentionally, why being attractive in ancient Greece was a serious occupational hazard. If you zoom out a bit, you can almost see the pattern. Zeus seduces, Hera retaliates, mortals suffer, then geography quietly rebrands the trauma into a map feature. It's tidy in a deeply unsettling way. But there's something about Io's quiet endurance that lingers. She doesn't fight back, she can't. She just keeps moving. From Greece to the sea, across strange lands, through pain and silence, until she finally reaches peace. It's a kind of divine marathon, the slow transformation of suffering into mythic geography. And in that sense, she outlasted both Hera and Zeus. She became part of the earth itself. Sometimes, when ancient writers described her final moments, they'd soften the scene. Io standing by the Nile, sunlight glinting on the water, her reflection human again. The air warm, the flies gone. Her first deep breath in years. The river carrying away the last echoes of a cow's lowing, replaced by silence. The silence of someone who has survived gods. The myth ends with calm, but you can almost feel Athena somewhere in the background, watching. Because that's what she did. Observed. Occasionally stepped in when things got too messy, though usually after the fact. If she learned anything from Io's story, it was probably this. You can outsmart mortals easily. But divine stupidity? That's eternal. Still, Hera and Zeus's endless quarrels gave Athens something important, moral contrast. Athena, as their opposite, stood for control, intelligence, and restraint. No seductions. No transformations. Just logic. Well, mostly logic. Because even Athena had her questionable moments. And we'll drift toward one of those next. A story about a mortal sculptor, an ivory statue, and a goddess who accidentally inspired the world's first Pygmalion complex. Chapter 9. Pygmalion and the Ivory Girl Who Wouldn't Blink. There's a special kind of loneliness reserved for artists who think their work understands them better than people do. And in ancient mythology, that loneliness often turned into a moral lesson about hubris, or, occasionally, into an awkward love story with an inanimate object. Enter Pygmalion. He was a sculptor. Talented, reclusive, and, by all accounts, very done with humanity. The myths don't tell us exactly what people did to drive him away, but given how ancient Greek society worked, it's safe to assume it involved a combination of gossip, failed relationships, and too many symposiums that ended with someone quoting Homer badly. So Pygmalion withdrew to his workshop on Cyprus, surrounded by stone, chisels, and his own perfectionism. He'd look at the world and see flaws everywhere. The gods were vain. The men were foolish. The women were, in his opinion, shallow, conniving, and unreliable. A bold stance for a man who'd apparently never considered therapy. So he made a vow. He would never marry. He would live for his art, which, in mythological terms, is practically begging for irony to strike. One day, Pygmalion began sculpting a woman out of ivory. He took his time. Every curve, every detail, every faint line of expression, he carved them with obsessive care. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And somewhere along the way, the project stopped being just a statue. He named her Galatea, which roughly translates to she who is milk white. She was in his eyes, flawless. And that was precisely the problem, because Pygmalion, despite his earlier vow of isolation, started to fall in love. He'd brush the ivory cheek and imagine warmth. He'd whisper compliments into the air and convince himself she listened. He even brought her gifts, shells, jewels, little birds, bits of fine cloth. It was objectively concerning, even for ancient Greece. But the myth doesn't judge him harshly. In fact, it leans in, treating his obsession as poetic rather than creepy. Every night, he'd dream of Galatea alive. Every morning, he'd wake up to cold ivory and the faint shame of realizing he was still very much alone. He wasn't a bad man, just deluded by beauty and the illusion of control, which makes him surprisingly relatable for someone who lived in a world of literal gods. Now, the goddess Aphrodite, who adored irony almost as much as love, decided to intervene. It happened during her festival, when the people of Cyprus brought offerings to her temple. Pygmalion went too. He stood before her altar and quietly asked, "Grant me a wife like my ivory girl." He didn't dare ask for the statue itself to come to life. Even he knew that sounded unhinged. But Aphrodite, with her usual sense of dramatic timing, understood exactly what he meant. When he returned home, something was different. The room felt warmer, the air softer. The statue's eyes, those perfect, polished eyes, seemed to hold a spark that hadn't been there before. He reached out, hesitantly, and when he touched her hand, it gave. Not cold, not rigid, soft. Like flesh warming under sunlight. He stepped back, startled, watching as the colors spread through her, ivory to rose, stillness to breath. Galatea blinked. And just like that, she lived. There's no record of what her first words were. Mostly because the poets cared more about Pygmalion's emotional breakdown than her perspective. But you can imagine it. The confusion, the sensory overload, the gentle panic of realizing you exist because someone imagined you too hard. Aphrodite's magic, after all, didn't come with an instruction manual. Still, Galatea smiled at him, and he fell to his knees, overjoyed. The sculptor and his statue embraced. And, in what might be mythology's calmest happy ending, they simply lived together, peacefully, for the rest of their days. They even had a son, Paphos, who went on to found the Cypriot city of the same name, because in Greek mythology, even love stories double as geography lessons. Now, depending on which version you read, Galatea was either grateful or quietly horrified. Later philosophers, especially the Stoics, preferred to see her as a symbol of the soul awakening. Poets saw her as the muse perfected, an embodiment of art becoming life. But if you squint, you can also see the darker side. A man builds a woman exactly how he wants her. She comes to life and immediately rewards him with affection. It's a little on the nose. Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, probably watched this entire episode with an eyebrow raised. After all, sculpture was her domain too. But she worked in logic, not longing. You can almost imagine her sighing somewhere on Olympus. Another man who built something intelligent and immediately tried to marry it. Because of course he did. Still, the myth of Pygmalion survived precisely because it's so strangely gentle. There's no betrayal, no divine punishment, no tragic ending. Just a quiet story about a craftsman who loved his own creation until it loved him back. It's the inverse of so many Greek tales. No hubris, no downfall. Just a sort of sleepy wish fulfillment where obsession becomes reward. Almost boring. Which, frankly, is rare for these people. But the Pygmalion story became something much larger over time. Writers and artists kept retelling it for centuries. Each generation saw something different in it. For the Victorians, it was about the redemptive power of love. For modern readers, it's a commentary on control and projection. And for insomniacs listening to Greek myths at 2 a.m., it's just a surprisingly calm interlude between the usual divine chaos. What's fascinating, though, is that Pygmalion's creation wasn't unique in Greek thought. The Greeks were oddly obsessed with the idea of man-made life. Hephaestus, the god of metalwork, forged mechanical servants. Daedalus, the inventor, built statues that could move and speak. Even Prometheus tried his hand at sculpting humanity itself, and promptly got punished for giving them fire. It's as if every craftsman in myth secretly wanted to play God, just on a smaller, slightly less apocalyptic scale. And yet, only Pygmalion's version ends well. Because he doesn't try to conquer nature, he idealizes it. He doesn't challenge the gods, he appeals to them. Aphrodite saw his longing not as arrogance, but as devotion. And maybe that's why she helped. He wasn't trying to replace love. He was just trying to understand it, one chisel stroke at a time. You can almost picture him, late at night, sitting beside Galatea as she slept, or at least pretended to. The workshop quiet, the tools put away. Moonlight falling on marble dust and unfinished dreams. For once, he didn't feel alone. And perhaps that's the softest miracle in all of Greek mythology. A man finding peace without anyone dying, transforming, or being turned into livestock. The story of Pygmalion drifts to an end there, untroubled and slow. But as always, another thread of mythology waits just beyond it. Because not every sculptor handled inspiration quite so gracefully. Some took divine muses a little too literally. And next, we'll glide into the tale of Daedalus, builder of wonders, father of Icarus, and the man who proved that genius and bad parenting often go hand in hand. Chapter 10. Daedalus and the original DIY disaster. Daedalus was what you'd call a problem-solving overachiever. Inventor, sculptor, architect. The guy had ideas. Big ones. Usually involving wings, gears, and at least one person regretting everything later. He was the Greek world's first engineer. And, like many great engineers, he spent half his life fixing the problems created by his earlier inventions. Daedalus was an Athenian originally, though he eventually ended up in Crete, which was sort of the ancient Mediterranean equivalent of moving to Silicon Valley after a scandal. Because yes, there was a scandal. There's always a scandal. He had a nephew named Talos. Talos was bright, talented, and very good at inventing things himself. So good, in fact, that Daedalus got jealous. Talos once carved a fishbone into a saw. Another time, he created the potter's wheel. Basically, he was the kid who finishes your crossword before you've even found a pen. One day, Daedalus took Talos to the roof of the Acropolis to talk about ideas. And then, as myths love to phrase it, he threw him off. You know, mentorship, ancient Greek style. Athena naturally intervened at the last moment and turned the boy into a partridge, sparing his life. Daedalus, however, was not spared public opinion. He was banished from Athens. So he fled to Crete, the island of labyrinths, bulls, and emotional overcommitment. King Minos welcomed him with open arms, thrilled to have the legendary craftsman at his court. And for a while, things were good. Daedalus designed palaces, temples, mechanical wonders. He even helped Queen Pasiphae with a particularly delicate engineering request. Yes, that one. See, Pasiphae was married to Minos, but the gods, or maybe just divine irony, decided she would fall in love with a bull. It wasn't her fault, apparently. Poseidon had cursed her husband, and she became collateral damage. Pasiphae, desperate to fulfill her bizarre passion, went to Daedalus. And Daedalus, professional to the end, didn't ask too many questions. He built her a hollow wooden cow she could climb into. Life-size, realistic, complete with a cowhide cover. We don't need to dwell on the logistics. Suffice it to say, the device worked. And from that deeply cursed union came the Minotaur. Half man, half bull, full nightmare. King Minos, understandably alarmed, needed a place to keep the creature. And Daedalus, apparently still on retainer, was given the job. So he designed the labyrinth, a vast, winding maze beneath the palace at Knossos. It was the ultimate puzzle box. No doors, no clear paths, no escape. A place so confusing even Daedalus himself could barely navigate it. He built it for Minos, but probably also for himself. A sanctuary for brilliance that no one else could understand. The Minotaur was placed inside. And Crete carried on, pretending that regularly feeding Athenian teenagers to a half-bull monster was just a normal aspect of monarchy. But myths have a way of attracting heroes. And eventually, one showed up, Theseus. Theseus arrived with all the self-confidence of a man who thought heroism was mostly about having nice calves. He volunteered to enter the labyrinth, kill the Minotaur, and end the whole disturbing tourism program. Minos agreed because he assumed Theseus would die. But Theseus had help from Ariadne, Minos's daughter, who fell hopelessly in love with him after approximately 3 seconds. Ariadne went to Daedalus, because when in doubt, talk to the guy who built the maze. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread, a simple, elegant solution. Unwind it as Theseus went in, follow it to find his way out. It worked perfectly. Theseus killed the Minotaur, escaped, and promptly abandoned Ariadne on an island. Because that's what heroes do in Greek mythology, save the day, then ghost you. King Minos was furious when he found out Daedalus had helped. You'd think he'd be grateful someone ended the annual sacrifice plan, but no, kings have a terrible sense of gratitude. So Minos locked Daedalus and his son, Icarus, in a tower, a high one overlooking the sea. No doors, no boats, no hope. Daedalus, however, was not the kind of man to be stopped by basic architecture. He started watching the seagulls. Then he started collecting feathers. Piece by piece, he began crafting wings. Wax for the base. Feathers arranged in careful rows. A madman's idea, but executed with the precision of genius. When both pairs were done, one for himself, one for Icarus, he gave his son the only piece of advice that would later make every moralist smile smugly. Don't fly too close to the sun. It was good advice, honestly. The problem was, Icarus was 18 and therefore incapable of following any. They launched at dawn, wings spread, wind rushing beneath them. It worked. The impossible, flying like birds, actually worked. For a while, they soared peacefully. Over the Aegean, past glittering islands, the sun rising behind them. But Icarus, exhilarated, forgot himself. He climbed higher. The wax softened. Feathers scattered like snow. And slowly he fell. Daedalus watched, helpless, as the sea swallowed his son. The waves took him, and the myth took shape. He landed safely on a distant shore, Sicily, some say, but the victory felt hollow. He'd built miracles. And all they'd done was take the people he loved. That's the quiet curse of every mythic inventor, brilliance without peace. He buried Icarus, built a temple to Apollo, hung up his wings as an offering, and stopped creating for a while. The sea where Icarus fell was named in his memory, the Icarian Sea. Another tragedy turned into geography. Later, King Minos tracked him down, because apparently grudges also travel well. He tried to lure Daedalus out of hiding with a riddle, threading a string through a spiral shell. Daedalus, naturally, solved it in 5 minutes by attaching the thread to an ant and letting it crawl through. Minos realized he'd been found and came for him personally, but was killed by a local king who didn't appreciate royal intrusions. Daedalus, at last, was free. He lived quietly after that. No more inventions, no grand designs. Just quiet reflection. He'd seen what happened when curiosity outpaced caution. He'd seen genius turn into loss. And perhaps, somewhere in the silence, he finally understood that creation always costs something. Athena would have liked Daedalus. He was clever, rational, and endlessly inventive. But she probably would have reminded him that wisdom isn't about building, it's about restraint. And Daedalus, brilliant as he was, never quite mastered that part. Still, his myth lingers because it feels oddly human. He wasn't cursed. He wasn't punished by jealous gods. He was just a man who wanted to see how far he could go, and discovered the hard way what happens when you forget to look down. The story of Daedalus drifts to an end there, wings folded, wax cooled. A little sad, a little wise. But the myths, as always, never truly stop. Because just beyond his shadow waits another god, one who made chaos in art form. The original prankster, the celestial troublemaker. Let's float toward Hermes next, the god who could talk his way out of any problem, including some he definitely caused himself. Chapter 11. Hermes and the baby who stole 40 cows before lunch. Greek gods are notoriously unreliable when it comes to ethics. Some are vengeful, some are vain, and some are just plain mischievous. Hermes, in particular, was the embodiment of the latter. God of travelers, thieves, herds, and communication, which, if you think about it, is a combination that makes perfect sense. He was clever, quick, and completely unbothered by rules. And like all good Greek gods, he made an entrance early, really early. Hermes was born in a cave on Mount Cyllene in Arcadia. His mother, Maia, was a nymph. His father, Zeus, was busy being Zeus. From the moment he was born, Hermes demonstrated an impressive talent for trouble. By sunset on his first day alive, he had already crawled out of the cave without asking permission, found a herd of cattle belonging to Apollo, stolen exactly 40 of them, all before lunch. And yes, he managed to do this without anyone, including his very powerful father, stopping him. Now, stealing from Apollo might sound like a bad idea. But Hermes was a baby, and in Greek mythology, that automatically grants you temporary immunity from consequences. He disguised his tracks by making the cattle walk backward. He wore sandals made from bark. He cleverly covered his own footprints with nearby leaves. By evening, the theft was essentially invisible. Hermes, apparently pleased with himself, decided to celebrate. He invented the first lyre from a tortoise shell, a completely random act of musical genius. He strung the shell with gut, the traditional Greek method, and discovered that music is, in fact, charming enough to mollify even very angry deities. He played the lyre quietly as if to say, "Look what I can do." And also, "You can't touch me." Which, of course, he was right about. Apollo soon discovered the missing cattle. He was not amused. He tracked Hermes down, following a trail of cleverly hidden signs. When he confronted the baby god, he found an infant casually playing a tortoise shell like it was the most natural thing in the world. Hermes, still in diapers, looked at Apollo and smiled. A dangerous smile. One that suggested he could solve problems with wit rather than violence. Apollo demanded his cattle back. Hermes, being newly born and highly persuasive, denied everything. The two argued, though the argument consisted mostly of Hermes squeaking and gesturing dramatically, and Apollo trying to interpret the squeaks. Eventually, they took their dispute to Zeus. Zeus, god of everything and king of terrible parenting, listened carefully. Then, as any reasonable parent might, he ruled, "Let them sort it out." Hermes handed over the cattle. Apollo, impressed by the baby's audacity and ingenuity, accepted them, after which Hermes offered him the lyre. Apollo, whose reputation included a love for music, accepted. Thus, Hermes' crime became the first recorded gift of artistic ingenuity in Greek myth. The baby who stole 40 cows had accidentally invented the musical instrument that would define a god. Hermes' early exploits established a few rules. Being clever can be more powerful than being big. Creativity can absolve mischief. If you steal 40 cows and invent the lyre, eventually everyone will forgive you. He was a paradox, infantile and brilliant, criminal and inventive, charming and infuriating. As he grew older, Hermes never stopped. He became the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls to the underworld, and the patron of travelers and merchants. Which is essentially the universe saying, we need someone to handle everything that doesn't fit neatly into Zeus' schedule. And Hermes was perfect for the job. The story of the baby thief reminds us of the curious morality of Greek mythology. Steal from a god? Sure, as long as you're inventive and charming. Hurt someone? Maybe, as long as it's entertaining. Survive infancy by cheating your way through divine justice? Absolutely. It's chaotic. It's illogical. And somehow it works. Hermes' later adventures, guiding souls, tricking giants, and occasionally meddling in mortal affairs, all stem from that first act. Cleverness as survival. The pattern is clear. He is the prototype for every schemer who ever got away with it. And, for our sleepy purposes, it's remarkably soothing. Because the story isn't about war, or tragedy, or gruesome revenge. It's about a baby who wanted what he wanted, solved his problem in style, and invented music along the way. By the time Hermes reached adolescence, which in Greek terms is roughly a few days old, he had already achieved legendary status. The myths tell us he had a fondness for pranks, an appreciation for cleverness, and a knack for being exactly where the story needed him to be, which made him a reliable fixture in the chaotic ecosystem of Olympus. We can imagine him, long after the cattle incident, wandering the divine hallways, lyre in hand, humming quietly to himself. He would tiptoe past Zeus, whisper to mortals, and generally remind everyone that even in a world ruled by capricious, all-powerful deities, a clever mind can thrive. Hermes' myth is small, simple, and oddly comforting. A baby steals cows. A god gets angry. A gift is made. Peace is restored. No epic battles. No permanent deaths. Just a problem solved in the most elegant, improbable, and slightly absurd way. And that's why, despite the chaos of Greek mythology, this story works as a gentle, sleepy lesson. Even a newborn can leave a mark. Even mischief can create beauty. And even in a world of gods and monsters, cleverness has its place. Chapter 12. The story of Arachne, when weaving became dangerous. In Greek mythology, talent is rarely just talent. It's a ticket to notice, and notice from the gods is usually complicated. Arachne was a young woman from Lydia, famous, or infamous, for her weaving skills. Not just good for a mortal good. She was exceptional. Her tapestries told stories. The threads sang. And she never, ever made a mistake. Naturally, this caught Athena's attention. Athena, goddess of wisdom, crafts, and just the faintest hint of jealousy when mortals show off, was always keeping tabs on ambitious humans. Arachne, in her modest way, didn't intend to offend anyone. She simply said something that, in mythological terms, might as well have been written in blood on Mount Olympus. I am better than Athena at weaving. There was. Spoken aloud. Bold, confident, slightly naive, and entirely mortal. Athena, upon hearing this, initially disguised herself as an old woman, standard divine protocol for giving mortals warnings without immediate smiting. She approached Arachne and said softly, "Child, that's a dangerous boast. Perhaps humility would suit you better." But Arachne, as myths insist on emphasizing, was not the sort to back down. She laughed politely, thanked the disguised goddess for her concern, and said, "Respectfully, no. I think I'll stick with my tapestries. They're flawless." At this point, Athena dropped the disguise. And of course, the air grew colder. The two agreed on a contest. The rules were simple. Each would weave a tapestry. No cheating. No divine interference. Winner would be the best weaver. Athena went first. Her tapestry depicted the gods in all their glory, wielding power, teaching mortals lessons, and generally being as awe-inspiring as a deity can be while still looking approachable. Arachne's tapestry, in contrast, depicted gods behaving badly, deceiving mortals, seducing women, punishing without cause. It was technically a critique. It was also breathtakingly precise. Every thread perfect. Every detail lifelike. The crowd of onlookers, probably a mixture of humans and curious minor deities, murmured. It was perfect. Athena looked. She squinted. She tugged at the threads of her own tapestry. And then she did what Athena always does when faced with human audacity. She got very, very, very annoyed. Technically, Arachne hadn't cheated. She hadn't lied. But her skill and the audacity behind it made the goddess' pride prick like thorns. Athena struck the tapestry. She touched Arachne's head, and in a calm, deliberate gesture, turned her into a spider. It was poetic punishment, really. A reminder that weaving without humility, or criticizing the gods, could literally transform your life. Arachne, now tiny, eight-legged, and vaguely horrified, began spinning silk from her own body. And here's the ironic part. She was still weaving beautifully. Her talent didn't vanish. It just became small-scale. And mythologically, that's how spiders came to spin webs. Every thread a reminder of human skill, divine jealousy, and the faint moral about knowing your place. Athena, in the aftermath, didn't exactly apologize. But she did allow Arachne to continue her weaving. In other words, talent survives, even under punishment. But arrogance? That tends to sting a little, literally. Arachne's story floats quietly on the edge of Greek mythology. It's not tragic in the traditional sense. No deaths, no wars. No permanent chaos. Just a lesson wrapped in silk. Skill can be admired, but hubris makes gods twitchy. The myth also subtly celebrates artistry. Arachne wasn't punished for being perfect. She was punished for having the audacity to be perfect in a way that pointed out the flaws of immortals. And if you think about it, that's kind of soothing, because the story ends with continuity, not calamity. We can imagine her tiny spider body at the base of trees. Night winds stirring, dew collecting on her silk. Quiet patience. Tireless creativity. For centuries, spiders have gone about their work. Tiny, unnoticed, yet marvelously capable. It's a gentle echo of Arachne, still crafting, still meticulous, still defying oblivion. In a way, Arachne is the perfect bridge between human and divine. She shows that mortal skill can rival gods, but also that gods are sensitive about critique. It's oddly relatable. We all create, we all compare, and sometimes we all face gods in the form of teachers, bosses, or overly critical peers. Arachne's myth transforms that anxiety into something soft, measured, and eternal. Even after being turned into a spider, her artistry endures. The lesson? You can be constrained, you can be punished, but your essence, your skill, your persistence, can quietly persist, weaving through time. The quiet beauty of this myth is its rhythm. There is a beginning, a talented mortal, confident in her abilities. A middle, a confrontation with divine authority. And an ending, transformation, adaptation, continuity. No epic battles. No fatal hubris. Just a gentle reminder that life, even when you're tiny and eight-legged, continues. Athena, naturally, remains calm afterward. She retreats to Olympus, probably rolling her eyes occasionally, but satisfied that Arachne's punishment ensures humans will respect divine boundaries, softly, subtly, and mostly without complaint. Meanwhile, Arachne spins her webs. Morning dew collects. The wind shifts. And the quiet, infinite cycle of creation continues. Later cultures would reinterpret Arachne. Some saw her as a warning, some as a martyr of skill, and some, quietly, as a symbol of female ingenuity surviving against constraints. All interpretations emphasize the same core. Even under divine control, talent finds a way to persist. And as you imagine her, tiny and patient, spinning silk in moonlight, you might notice how calming it is. No frantic struggles. No loud disasters. Just creation. Persistence. Continuity. A perfect story to drift into the gentle edge of sleep. From spiders and silk, we can float to other quiet, gentle myths. Stories of patience, ingenuity, and the minor tragedies of immortal and mortal lives intertwined. Chapter 13. King Midas and the Golden Touch That Wasn't Fun. King Midas, a man whose story begins with a simple wish and ends with, well, a quiet, cautionary sigh. Midas was a king in Phrygia, known for his wealth, his love of luxury, and most importantly, his curiosity about gold. He was not evil, exactly, just indulgent, fond of shiny things, and utterly unprepared for the consequences of his own desires. The story starts with a god, Dionysus, the god of wine, festivity, and occasional overreaction. Dionysus had a satyr companion, Silenus, who got lost during one of his wine-soaked rambles. Midas, being king and unusually polite, found Silenus wandering and decided to host him for 10 days. He fed him, clothed him, and generally tolerated his drunken stories about grapes and immortality. It was a quiet kindness. One of those gestures that doesn't make headlines except in myths. When Dionysus found Silenus, he was grateful. And, of course, gods always express gratitude through some kind of magical gift. You may ask for anything, Dionysus said to Midas. Anything at all. And Midas, after a moment of thought that would have benefited from a pause for reason, said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. Dionysus, being polite and slightly amused, granted the wish. At first, Midas was thrilled. He touched his chairs, his crown, even his own royal robe, and it instantly turned gold. It glittered, shone, made that satisfying metallic ting sound when tapped. He probably spent an hour just walking around his palace, touching furniture, doors, and coins. It felt perfect. Then came dinner. Midas, still excited, reached for a bunch of grapes. Touched them. Golden grapes. Inedible golden grapes. He tried bread next. Same problem. He tried water. Well, it didn't exactly turn gold, but let's just say hydration became a problem. Suddenly, his perfect wish felt like a very shiny prison. Things only got worse. His beloved daughter, described as beautiful, gentle, and entirely unaware of the trouble about to unfold, ran into the room. Midas, absent-mindedly, hugged her, and she turned into solid gold. The palace was quiet, and in that silence, Midas realized the consequences of wishes made in haste. He had everything he wanted, but also nothing. No food, no drink, no living daughter to talk to. It's a quiet kind of horror, not the kind with blood or monsters. Just the kind that makes you want to sit in a corner and think very carefully about your decisions. Midas ran to Dionysus, begging for the gift to be undone. Dionysus, not unkindly, told him to wash in the river Pactolus. Do so, and all would be returned to normal. Midas obeyed. He soaked himself in the river. The gold washed away. And somehow, the sands of the river kept a faint, permanent shimmer, a little reminder of his greed. The story doesn't end with punishment. It ends with quiet wisdom. Midas learned that desire without foresight can be dangerous, that abundance without thought can become limitation. and that even kings, surrounded by wealth, are not immune to error. Later myths embellish Midas' story. Some say he developed a fondness for music after angering Apollo. Another quiet, slow lesson in taste and humility. Others claim he retired from gold collecting and spent the rest of his days appreciating simple pleasures, gardens, quiet walks, and perhaps reading poetry to avoid touching things too eagerly. It's a soft, sleepy ending. No battles. No catastrophic divine wrath. Just reflection and quiet regret. Midas' story has a rhythm. The build-up, excitement, desire, shiny things. The middle, small joys quickly turning to inconvenience. The resolution, humility, calm, and a touch of melancholy. It's soothing because it doesn't rely on chaos. It's a myth about awareness, about noticing the consequences of your actions before they become irreversible. We can picture him later, sitting by a river, watching water slip past his hands, remembering his daughter, and quietly savoring life's small, mundane pleasures. Perhaps he touches a flower, smiles, doesn't wish it into gold. It's a gentle story of moderation, a rare calm in the otherwise stormy world of Greek myths. The myth of Midas complements the others we've explored. Io endured suffering quietly and patiently. Pygmalion loved, carefully, and was rewarded. Hermes solved problems with wit and charm. Arachne created with perfection, endured consequences, and continued her craft. Midas? He's a reminder that desire, unchecked, can quietly consume everything you care about, but reflection can restore peace. For our sleepy purpose, the tale of Midas is ideal. It drifts slowly. Desire arises. Consequences unfold. Resolution arrives through quiet, deliberate action. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't shock. It allows the mind to relax, gently contemplating cause and effect. In imagining Midas, we picture the palace once golden, now quiet. Rivers shimmer faintly with leftover magic. The king sits contemplatively, watching water flow, considering life's simpler joys. A calm, gentle myth. Chapter 14. Orpheus and Eurydice. Music, mistakes, and one step too far. Orpheus was, by all accounts, a soft-spoken genius. His talent wasn't for war or politics. It wasn't for dramatic speeches or heroic feats. He was a musician, a poet, someone who could make stone weep with song, rivers pause to listen, and birds harmonize just to match his tone. Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a mortal woman whose grace was quiet but compelling. Their marriage seemed calm, gentle, and entirely devoted. But fate, in its slow, unrelenting way, intervened. Shortly after their wedding, Eurydice was bitten by a snake. Venom spread quietly through her veins. She died. It was sudden, not violent, not dramatic, just final. Orpheus, understandably, was devastated. He grieved in the only way he knew, through music. He played his lyre, and the forest, rivers, and winds bent to his sorrow. Trees leaned closer. Stones softened. Even the gods paused, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of respect. Hades, lord of the underworld, heard the music. Not often moved, he listened. He allowed Orpheus to enter the underworld to retrieve Eurydice. It was a rare concession, a slow, deliberate miracle of myth. Orpheus descended. He played for Hades and Persephone. His notes carried the weight of love, loss, and meticulous sorrow. The underworld softened, chains loosened, gates opened, and the river Styx rippled with quiet awe. The king and queen of the dead agreed. Eurydice could return with Orpheus under one condition. He must not look back at her until they reached the upper world. Simple in concept, difficult in execution, because the journey was long, silent, except for the faint echo of distant ghosts. And Eurydice, following him faithfully, barely visible, depended entirely on his trust. Step by step, Orpheus ascended. The light above grew faintly, teasing the eyes. His heart raced. He imagined the first glimpse of the living sky, the warm sunlight on Eurydice's face. And then, a subtle, human error. One step too many, one glance too long. Turned. Eurydice was gone. The underworld claimed her once more. Orpheus had failed, not through malice, but through impatience and love. It's a quiet tragedy. Not loud, not violent. Just loss, and the echo of a single misstep. Orpheus lingered on the upper world. He continued to play. His music became softer, sadder, but infinitely more beautiful. The story emphasizes patience and human limitation. It doesn't punish through spectacle. It punishes softly, through the immutable fact of mortality. Later myths suggest Orpheus rejected the company of women. He wandered, lyre in hand, living in calm sorrow. Sometimes, the Maenads of Dionysus confronted him, violently at times. But mostly, the myth prefers the quiet imagery of music over blood. He was eventually killed by these followers, torn apart, but even then, the story lingers in the soft resonance of his songs. His head floated down a river, still singing. A gentle, ghostly music accompanying the flow of water. Orpheus myth is soothing in a melancholy way. There's grief, certainly, but also artistry, persistence, and the delicate balance of human and divine interaction. The lesson drifts slowly. Love can inspire greatness. Mistakes, even small ones, carry consequences. But beauty, quiet, enduring, immortal beauty, persists. We can picture him, lyre in hand, walking under starlight. No urgency, no chaos, just the soft rhythm of strings echoing across hills and rivers, calming the world in its subtle insistence. Orpheus is one of the rare figures in mythology who combines skill, emotion, and the inevitability of human error into a story that is both instructive and hypnotically gentle. His narrative also contrasts with many other myths we've explored. Pygmalion, love through creation. Daedalus, ingenuity with cautionary undertones. Hermes, cleverness and mischief. Midas, desire tempered by reflection. Orpheus embodies the quiet tragedy of human imperfection and the soothing constancy of art. As the story drifts to a close, we can imagine the world of Orpheus. Rivers reflecting pale moonlight, trees swaying gently to his music, stones and flowers leaning toward the soft vibrations of his strings. It's the perfect myth for calm reflection, a reminder that even in sadness, there is persistence. Even in loss, there is beauty. Even in error, there is story. And so Orpheus continues, in every retelling. His myth doesn't demand loud attention. It doesn't rely on terror or spectacle. It drifts quietly through time, carrying with it the calm rhythm of strings and human longing. Chapter 15. Penelope, the queen who weaved time itself. Penelope, wife of Odysseus, is famous not for battles or God's interventions, but for patience. Quiet, deliberate, slow-moving, enduring patience. Her story unfolds mostly in her palace, where she faces the challenge of waiting and waiting and waiting for her husband's return. Odysseus was away for 20 years. 10 years at war, 10 years drifting from place to place, surviving one calamity after another. And during that entire time, Penelope remained at home. She had her kingdom to manage, her son to raise, and, crucially, over 100 suitors invading her halls. Each one impatient, loud, and entirely convinced she would choose one of them instead of waiting for a man who had been gone for 2 decades. Penelope, however, had a plan. She promised the suitors she would choose one of them once she finished weaving a shroud for Laertes, her father-in-law. A simple enough task, a respectful, familial duty. But here's where her cleverness shines. Each night, she unraveled what she wove during the day. Day after day, night after night, the shroud never grew. Time passed. Years passed. The suitors grew frustrated. This quiet, repetitive act, weaving by day, unweaving by night, is the epitome of slow, hypnotic resistance. It's meticulous. It's deliberate. It's perfectly suited to the kind of gentle, sleepy mythic storytelling we've been exploring. Penelope didn't need battles or magic. She had her hands, her loom, and a mind patient enough to outlast the hubris and entitlement of others. The suitors, naturally, noticed something was off. They tried to pressure her. They argued, complained, and occasionally threatened. But Penelope never wavered. Her quiet intelligence and restraint, almost invisible in its subtlety, preserved her household. And all the while, she remained emotionally steady, if understandably wistful. Her son, Telemachus, grew up under her guidance. He learned patience, cunning, and the subtler arts of strategy from observing her. He learned that not all battles are fought with swords. Some are won with time, subtlety, and quiet persistence. Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, took note. She favored Penelope, not because Penelope had divine powers, but because she embodied them: strategy, foresight, patience. Athena quietly aided her, subtly influencing events to protect her household and ensure that her plans would unfold. Meanwhile, Odysseus continued his wanderings. Weaving and unweaving the shroud became Penelope's ritual, a meditation of sorts. Day into night, year into year, threads moving through her fingers, representing both devotion and quiet strategy. And yet, the story remains calm. No dramatic battles here. No loud catastrophes. Just a woman exercising intelligence, creativity, and patience over an extended period. Eventually, Odysseus returned, disguised, cautious, wary of the suitors who had overrun his home. Penelope, ever vigilant, tested him, not aggressively, not dramatically, but carefully. She asked about their bed, knowing only he could answer correctly. It was a quiet climax, a recognition of patience, endurance, and careful reasoning over chaos and impulsivity. Penelope's story, in many ways, contrasts with the more active myths we've explored. Pygmalion acted impulsively in love. Midas wished impulsively. Orpheus glanced impulsively. Penelope's virtue is the opposite: restraint. Slow, methodical, steady. An almost hypnotic rhythm that carries the narrative forward. We can imagine her at the loom in the dim light of her palace, hands moving silently, threads crossing, patterns forming, unraveling, and forming again. Outside, the suitors complain. Inside, the queen maintains order, stability, and quiet dignity. It's a story well suited for calm reflection and gentle drift toward sleep. The quiet wisdom of Penelope's narrative also speaks to human ingenuity. You don't need divine powers to survive. You need patience, cleverness, and endurance. And sometimes, a simple loom is more powerful than swords or magic. Even after Odysseus' return, Penelope remained measured. She didn't immediately embrace him. She didn't display exaggerated emotion. She tested him, ensured that her long years of vigilance were respected, and then quietly resumed her household, now restored, now balanced, now complete. Her story resonates because it's fundamentally human, waiting without despair, acting without spectacle, exercising intelligence and strategy quietly over long stretches of time. There is rhythm here, repetition, calm perseverance, a gentle ebb and flow suitable for reflective thought and sleepy contemplation. Penelope demonstrates that heroism doesn't always involve glory or loud confrontation. It can be subtle, measured, thread by thread. In imagining her life, we picture dim candlelight flickering across threads of wool, hands moving silently, a quiet palace, still under siege, yet under control, time passing in calm, deliberate increments. It's the perfect myth for a slow, hypnotic evening. Chapter 16. Daedalion, Quiet Grief and Wings of Sorrow. Daedalion is one of those figures in Greek mythology who exists quietly on the edge of the major stories. Not a king, not a hero, not a god, just a mortal with a lineage of warriors and a capacity for deep sorrow. His story unfolds softly, patiently, and with a rhythm suited for reflection rather than excitement. Daedalion was the son of Chiron, the centaur known for wisdom and mentoring heroes. He inherited intelligence, respect, and perhaps a certain stoicism from his father. But he also inherited a capacity for intense grief. Because, as often happens in myths, grief arrived early and unexpectedly. Daedalion had a daughter, or in some versions, a close companion, named Chione. She was beautiful, quiet, and devoted, and she became the object of attention from gods. Apollo, the ever-watchful god of music, prophecy, and light, noticed her. He was drawn to her beauty and charm, as gods tend to be. In one gentle but fateful event, Apollo approached her. She, like many mortals confronted by divine admiration, was cautious, shy, or perhaps stubborn, depending on the version. In some tellings, the interaction goes tragically wrong. Chione either dies or suffers a fate that evokes quiet, lingering grief in her father. Daedalian, faced with the sudden loss, retreats from action into sorrow. Unlike heroes who rush to vengeance or rage, Daedalian's grief is internalized. Silent, measured, almost meditative. He climbs a mountain. He wanders forests. He stands by rivers. And in his sorrow, he contemplates mortality, the fickleness of divine favor, and the delicate fragility of life. The gods, ever observant, notice. And here, the story drifts into transformation rather than punishment or reward. Apollo and Artemis, twin deities who often intervene with subtlety, respond. They recognize the intensity of Daedalian's grief. And in mythological logic, grief at this level requires a physical manifestation. Daedalian is transformed into a hawk. This is not a violent transformation. It is quiet, slow, reflective. He gains wings. He gains a new perspective on the world. And his sorrow is carried through the skies, visible to those who look closely, but never loud or disruptive. The hawk is a symbol of vigilance, observation, and quiet control. Daedalian, once tied to the pain of mortality, now glides above forests and mountains. His grief remains, but it is softened, spread thin over the wind and sky. It's not punishment, it's preservation. A way for myth to honor sorrow without letting it overwhelm. There is subtle wisdom in this story. Grief, when acknowledged, can transform rather than destroy. Sorrow can be carried, not buried. Mortality and loss are inevitable, but perspective can create quiet endurance. We can imagine Daedalian, wings stretched wide, gliding over silent forests. Streams reflecting the dawn. Trees whispering in soft breezes. Mountains standing tall, patient, and unmoved. And he, carrying his quiet grief, becomes part of the natural rhythm. In this sense, Daedalian's myth is gentle, hypnotic, and meditative. It doesn't rely on violence. It doesn't feature dramatic confrontation. It offers a steady cadence of cause and effect, of loss and transformation. This quiet narrative contrasts with the more active myths we've explored. Hermes, mischief embodied, solves problems actively. Orpheus attempts to defy death through art, only to face subtle consequence. Penelope patiently resists chaos through weaving and cleverness. Daedalian's story emphasizes reflection and internalized emotion. It's almost entirely silent, save for the imagined sound of wings through air. The myth also subtly reminds us of the link between humans and nature. Daedalian's sorrow is not erased. It is transformed into flight. Grief becomes movement, reflection becomes perspective. The hawk soars, unseen by most, yet fully present. We can picture him circling above valleys and hills, observing streams glittering in the sun, noticing mortals walking through forests, gliding calmly, carrying the weight of sorrow without falling victim to it. It's a perfect story for slow, reflective contemplation, the kind that lulls a listener into calm, gentle thought. In myth, as in life, grief can be overwhelming. Daedalian shows us another approach: endurance, quiet observation, and transformation. It is not about overcoming loss dramatically. It is about carrying it gracefully, giving it wings, and moving forward. His story, gentle as it is, reminds us of a central theme in many myths. Talent and skill require patience. Loss and sorrow can be transformed, not erased. Mortality is finite, but the ways we carry ourselves can extend beyond the immediate moment. And so, Daedalian becomes more than a tragic figure. He becomes a quiet symbol of resilience, of reflection, and of gentle endurance. We can leave him there for now. Hawk wings catching soft breezes. Eyes scanning forests. Grief diffused into motion. Silence, almost perfect, surrounding him. Chapter 17. Aesop, the man who spoke softly but endured forever. Aesop is not a god. He is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is a man whose power lay in words, patience, and observation. He is the master of subtlety, of quiet moral instruction, and of slow, enduring influence. He was, according to the most persistent legends, born a slave in ancient Greece, which already places him in a position requiring careful strategy and quiet intelligence. Life under ownership demanded observation, subtlety, and patience, qualities that would define his storytelling. Aesop's intelligence was recognized by his masters, although perhaps grudgingly. He had a voice, yes, but more importantly, he had a mind capable of framing lessons in ways that others could not ignore. His fables, simple stories of animals, humans, and gods, carried subtle truths. Not loud, not forceful, not dramatic. Just quiet insight wrapped in narrative simplicity. Consider a typical fable. The tortoise and the hare. The fox and the grapes. The crow and the pitcher. Each story is short, measured, and rhythmic. Each conveys a subtle moral. Each relies on observation rather than spectacle. Aesop's gift was patience. He understood timing. He understood human weakness and strength. And he understood the power of narrative to shape thought quietly over time. Unlike the gods, he did not enforce lessons through magic or punishment. He allowed them to unfold, gently, within the mind of the listener. His fables often involve cleverness and foresight. The tortoise wins because he moves steadily. The fox ignores the grapes he cannot reach. The crow cleverly solves the puzzle of the pitcher. Notice the quiet parallels with previous myths. Penelope weaves and unweaves, relying on patience. Hermes resolves problems through wit. Daedalion transforms grief into perspective. Aesop's lessons are subtle extensions of these qualities in mortal form. It is likely he delivered these fables in person. Stories told around firelight or at quiet gatherings. No grand amphitheaters. No dramatic effects. Just words, carefully chosen, rhythms carefully placed to linger in the listener's mind. Even in danger, Aesop exercised subtlety. Some accounts suggest he offended rulers with his cleverness, but he survived long enough to spread his fables widely. Some say he was eventually executed, quietly and without fanfare. But by then, his influence had already taken root, soft and enduring. Aesop's myth, or legend, depending on your perspective, emphasizes a slow, meditative power. Influence does not require force. Wisdom need not be loud. Patience and observation can outlast even the most capricious rulers. Imagine him, sitting by a fire, speaking to attentive listeners. Each word deliberate, each story a thread woven into the quiet tapestry of thought. It is a calm image, one that invites reflection rather than tension. Perfect for a slow, sleepy evening. Aesop's enduring influence is, of course, remarkable. Centuries later, his fables are still told. Not because of dramatic spectacle, not because of magical intervention, but because of the quiet, human truths embedded in each story. Cleverness endures. Patience pays off. Observation reveals hidden patterns. Aesop's life also emphasizes resilience in the face of constraint. Born a slave, limited in mobility and social power, he transformed limitations into creativity. His storytelling became his freedom, soft but persistent. No flashy heroics, no divine intervention, no dramatic revenge. Just the enduring power of words carefully chosen and patiently delivered. This makes him a subtle counterpart to many myths we've explored. Hermes' cleverness solves problems immediately. Midas' impulsive desire leads to temporary catastrophe. Orpheus' art moves gods but fails due to human impatience. Penelope's patience ensures stability and survival. Aesop embodies the long, quiet arc, influence without force, wisdom without spectacle, and persistence without attention. In imagining Aesop, we picture quiet rooms filled with listeners, small fires casting shadows across attentive faces, the soft rhythm of repeated moral lessons settling slowly into the consciousness of each person. Stories carrying across generations, unseen yet persistent, like threads in an eternal loom. Aesop's fables, like many of the myths we've explored, are hypnotic in their simplicity. Animals behave predictably yet teach subtly. Humans learn without coercion. Patterns reveal themselves slowly, with reflection. There is no chaos here, no violent divine wrath. Just the soft, enduring cadence of wisdom transmitted through story. And so, Aesop quietly mirrors the world of the gods and heroes we have been visiting. Human skill, patience, and cleverness can survive where brute force cannot. Subtlety endures. Quiet reflection shapes long-term outcomes. We can leave him in this calm place. Firelight flickering across the walls. The soft murmur of listeners. Words falling gently into attentive ears. The slow, persistent weaving of wisdom into culture, unnoticed by most, enduring beyond time. Chapter 18. Niobe, Mountains of Grief and Quiet Endurance. Niobe was, by most accounts, proud, perhaps a little too proud. She was queen of Thebes, married to Amphion, a man quietly capable of extraordinary things with music, but also patient and unassuming. Together, they had children. Many children, in fact, although exact numbers vary across myths. Niobe's pride wasn't unusual in Greek myths. Many mortals measured themselves against gods, and often they did so quietly, without seeking attention. Niobe, however, made the subtle but fateful mistake of comparing herself to a goddess. She boasted of her fertility and her children. Specifically, she contrasted herself with Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, whose divine children numbered only 2. 2 children? Niobe might have said, softly, in that mythic way of understatement. I have 14. Surely that makes me more admirable, more fruitful, more accomplished. Apollo and Artemis, who rarely tolerate mortal hubris quietly, heard her remarks. They did not respond with loud confrontation. They responded with methodical, deliberate retribution, the kind that unfolds slowly, quietly, and with a rhythm that leaves listeners almost numb. One by one, Niobe's children fell. Not in chaotic battle, not with dramatic screaming, just silently, swiftly, methodically. Niobe witnessed the loss with a quiet, growing horror. Her grief was deep, unrelenting, and almost meditative in its endurance. She fled to Mount Olympus, or in some versions, remained among the ruins of her home. Either way, she did not die immediately. Her sorrow was transformed gradually, subtly, like water eroding stone. The myths tell us she became a stone, a statue weeping endlessly. A quiet, immovable presence. Grief rendered permanent, visible to the world, but silent. This is the remarkable part of Niobe's myth, the transformation. Her pride led to loss. Her grief persisted. She became a monument to patience, endurance, and quiet suffering. Unlike Orpheus, who actively attempted to reverse fate, or Midas, who had an immediate, tactile experience of consequence, Niobe's punishment unfolds over time. It is slow, measured, inevitable. The stone weeping of Niobe is subtle yet hypnotic. Imagine the mountainside, cold stone glistening with unending tears, the wind whispering through cracks. Quiet solitude, unbroken for generations. Her story doesn't rely on drama. It relies on endurance, reflection, and transformation. Niobe also represents the interplay of human pride and divine balance. She did not intend harm. She simply measured herself against a goddess. And the gods responded in kind, not with spectacle, but with inevitable consequence. It is soothing, in a way, to see cosmic order maintained quietly. No battles, no chaos, just measured cause and effect. Her husband, Amphion, plays a minor role in this mythic sequence. He grieves quietly alongside her. In some versions, he dies from sorrow. In others, he survives but remains subdued, his musical skill turned inward, echoing the subdued rhythm of the story. The family, or what remains, becomes a reflection of mortality, human limitation, and quiet endurance. Niobe's myth also parallels natural rhythms. Rivers carry tears silently to the sea. Mountains endure, immovable, observing centuries pass. Grief settles, quiet but persistent, in every fold of stone and earth. It is almost hypnotic to contemplate, which makes it perfect for sleepy reflection. Interestingly, Niobe's pride and the resulting consequences are never shouted in the myth. They are not narrated with fear or violence. They are simply acknowledged, internalized, and then transformed. This lends the story a calm cadence, plus endurance, transformation. Each step unfolds quietly, allowing the listener to drift along with the rhythm of cause and consequence. The story also emphasizes humility, patience, and reflection. Human measures of greatness are fleeting. Divine perspective operates over long spans of time. Quiet endurance often outlasts impulsive pride. Niobe's stone form, weeping immovable, becomes a monument not only to sorrow but to the calm persistence of observation. She watches generations pass silently. We can imagine her on a cliffside, mist curling around the mountains, wind carrying soft whispers of passing seasons, streams trickling past her feet, time itself moving quietly around her unchanging presence. The story becomes almost meditative, a reflection on mortality, consequence, and the enduring rhythm of human and divine interaction. Niobe contrasts nicely with other figures we've explored. Penelope acts with patience but eventually achieves resolution. Daedalion transforms grief into wings and perspective. Aesop quietly transmits wisdom without confrontation. Niobe's endurance is silent, unending, and immovable. It is the slowest, softest echo of all the myths, perfect for a sleep-inducing narrative. Her legacy, quietly embedded in mountains and streams, reminds us. Grief can be transformed but remains persistent. Mortality carries subtle consequences. Time provides perspective but does not erase experience. And so we leave Niobe, stone and wind and quiet endurance, a monument to slow, meditative mythic rhythm. A story suited for gentle reflection and calm thought. Next, we will drift toward the story of Psyche and Eros, a myth of patience, love, and quiet trials, where human curiosity and divine guidance unfold in a measured, hypnotic rhythm. Chapter 19. Psyche and Eros, Love, Patience, and Gentle Trials. Psyche's story begins, like many Greek myths, with beauty. Not loud beauty, not striking in a chaotic way, but quiet, commanding, and just enough to catch the attention of gods. She was a mortal woman, daughter of a king, whose looks were so remarkable that people began to neglect the worship of Venus, goddess of love and desire. This is the soft kind of problem that often provokes subtle divine irritation. Venus, naturally, was not pleased. Her worshippers were ignoring her temples, her offerings, her subtle influence over desire. So she decided to intervene. Not with catastrophe at first, but with gentle manipulation, measured and deliberate. Venus commanded her son, Eros, the god of love, to make Psyche fall in love with a lowly, unremarkable man. Eros, true to his divine nature, obeyed. But as myths like to remind us, gods are not always precise in their execution. When Eros approached Psyche, he accidentally pricked himself, or sometimes, myths say, his arrow simply misfired. And, predictably, he fell in love with her. This is the first gentle twist in the story, divine intervention redirected by human and godly error. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, subtle, and perfectly suited for reflection. Psyche, unaware of her admirer, was eventually taken to a palace that appeared only at night. No one saw it in daylight. No one entered it except by invitation. It was a magical, soft, secluded environment, the perfect setting for slow, hypnotic events. Her unseen husband visited only at night. They spoke, they dined, they existed together, but she never saw his face. It was a relationship measured by trust, patience, and gentle ritual. Of course, curiosity intervened. Psyche's sisters, with the faintest whisper of envy and human tendency, encouraged her to see her husband's face. And one night she did. By candlelight, she glimpsed Eros. A wax spill, a sudden noise, The details vary. The point is quiet human curiosity, gentle, understandable, and entirely natural. But it broke the unspoken agreement with the divine. Eros fled. Psyche, now filled with longing and regret, began a series of soft trials imposed by Venus. These were not loud battles. They were tasks designed to test patience, endurance, and persistence. Sorting grains by type, a task so meticulous it would lull anyone into near coma with boredom. Fetching water from a distant, perilous source, performed carefully, step by step. Retrieving delicate beauty from the underworld, a journey of quiet observation and patience. Each task emphasized the same soft, hypnotic rhythm. Observe. Proceed carefully. Endure. Reflect. There is no chaos. No screaming. No dramatic bloodshed. The story unfolds in small increments, perfectly suited to the gentle drift of thought. Eros, in the meantime, is quietly frustrated. He watches, or perhaps hovers invisibly, letting Psyche endure and learn, but also remaining present in subtle ways. There is a rhythm to their interaction. Desire, mistake, separation, effort, reunion, all measured, all gentle. Eventually, Psyche completes the tasks. Venus, recognizing both her persistence and skill, relents. And here is the quiet climax. Psyche and Eros are reunited. Not in dramatic explosion, not in cataclysmic ceremony, but in gentle, eternal union. They marry. Psyche is granted immortality. And in some versions, they quietly live in peace, a reflection of patience rewarded over time. The myth emphasizes, love is not impulsive. Curiosity, while human, carries consequence. Patience and persistence can reconcile the mortal and divine. It is hypnotic, slow-moving, and soft in its moral rhythm. We can picture Psyche in her quiet palace. Candlelight flickering across soft walls. Threads of golden sunlight from early morning filtering gently through windows. Soft music, barely audible, as a reminder of divine presence. Steps measured, movements deliberate, and time passing gently, unhurried. Eros' role is also calming. He is not violent, not loud, not domineering. He is patient, watching, guiding in subtle ways. Their story is one of trust, measured learning, and eventual, quiet harmony. Psyche's trials also mirror earlier myths we've explored. Penelope's weaving, patience over years. Daedalian's grief transformed into wings, subtle endurance. Aesop's storytelling, gentle influence without force. Each emphasizes reflection, patience, and quiet observation as powerful forces. The tale's hypnotic cadence is soothing for sleep. Curiosity initiates subtle error. Tasks unfold slowly, deliberately. Reward arrives softly, without spectacle. It is a story that does not demand attention, yet gently holds it. We leave Psyche here, softly immortal, united with Eros. Wisdom and patience quietly rewarded. A rhythm of reflection, effort, and subtle triumph that carries a listener gently into calm thought. Next, we will drift into the story of Endymion, a mortal granted eternal sleep by divine whim, a myth that almost literally embodies the gentle, slow rhythm of rest and quiet observation. Chapter 20. Endymion, Eternal Sleep and Quiet Divine Favor. Endymion was a mortal, a shepherd, and, importantly, extremely handsome, at least according to the myths. Not flashy heroic handsome, not adorned with armor or gold, but soft, quiet, gently magnetic handsome, the sort of face that makes you pause without needing loud announcement. He lived on Mount Latmos, mostly tending sheep. His days were slow, measured, almost meditative. The sun rose. He grazed the flocks. The wind whispered. He slept. He dreamed. And he noticed the small rhythms of the world, the flow of streams, the flutter of leaves, the gentle movement of clouds across sky. Selene, the moon goddess, noticed him. She observed quietly, night after night, her silver light tracing his contours. She was captivated, not through magic or drama, but through quiet admiration. In some versions of the myth, she fell in love at first sight. In others, her fascination grew slowly over repeated observation. Either way, Selene desired to preserve this moment of beauty indefinitely. Endymion, being mortal, was subject to aging and death. But Selene, in her gentle way, offered a unique gift, eternal sleep. It was not dramatic, not violent, not even necessarily unpleasant. He would remain forever in a peaceful slumber, untouched by time. In some versions, he could wake to see Selene's moonlight. In others, he remained in soft, uninterrupted dreams. This quiet arrangement benefits both parties. Selene enjoys her gentle, consistent mortal companion. Endymion experiences endless rest, free from the pressures of mortality. Nature observes this calm union without interruption. It's a story perfectly suited to slow reflection, soft meditation, and even gentle sleep. Unlike Orpheus, whose grief and impatience led to tragic consequences, Endymion accepts his fate. Unlike Midas, whose impulsivity created chaos, Endymion benefits from quiet divine favor. Unlike Niobe, whose pride led to grief, Endymion is untroubled and unambitious. He exemplifies the soothing rhythm of patience and stillness. We can imagine him, lying on a soft bed of grass atop Mount Olympus. Streams reflecting moonlight, leaves drifting gently in the night wind. Soft, intermittent animal sounds completing the soundscape. Everything moves around him, yet he remains unchanged. A quiet anchor in the slow flow of time. Selene's role, while divine, is similarly gentle. She visits without interruption. She observes without interference. Her light provides a subtle rhythm to his eternal dreams. There is no loud magic, no dramatic thunder, no catastrophic divine intervention, just a steady, almost hypnotic arrangement of eternal sleep and quiet favor. The myth also emphasizes the contrast between mortal frailty and divine timelessness. Endymion cannot age, cannot die, cannot act beyond slumber. Selene continues to move through the night sky, her influence constant and calm. Mountains, rivers, and forests observe, unchanged by human concern. It is a soft, rhythmic meditation on time, mortality, and quiet favor. Some versions of the myth suggest Endymion dreams within his eternal sleep. Dreams of Selene, of pastoral life, of soft sunlight filtering through clouds. Dreams that continue the gentle cadence of his story, slow, uninterrupted, and rhythmic. It is, in every way, a myth designed for calm reflection rather than excitement. Endymion's story, in the context of myths we've explored, emphasizes calm resolution. Midas learns reflection after impulsivity. Orpheus demonstrates the limits of human patience. Penelope succeeds through quiet cunning. Aesop spreads wisdom without force. Niobe endures, transformed into stone, observing slowly. Psyche achieves love through measured trials. Endymion embodies the gentle extreme, complete stillness, untouched by chaos, and entirely compatible with the slow rhythm of the universe. We can picture him as an eternal anchor in Greek myth. Mountains rise and fall around him over centuries. Rivers continue their soft murmurs. Seasons drift across the landscape, unnoticed by him. The moon waxes and wanes above, providing the slow pulse of divine observation. The hypnotic rhythm is almost tangible, perfect for reflective thought or a sleep-inducing narrative. There is subtle poetry in the relationship between Endymion and Selene. Love without drama, desire without interruption, patience rewarded through stillness. It emphasizes the idea that some of the most enduring myths are not about spectacle, battles, or catastrophe. They are about rhythm, observation, and quiet endurance. In thinking about Endymion, we also consider his legacy. He is remembered not for ambition or action. He is remembered for stillness, quiet beauty, and patient endurance. He is a myth that soothes rather than shocks. It is rare in Greek mythology, but that rarity is part of what makes it hypnotic and perfect for slow storytelling. We leave him here, atop Mount Olympus. Eternal sleep beneath the silver glow of Selene. Mountains and rivers as quiet witnesses. A rhythm of stillness, calm, and continuity. Soft, subtle, unending observation. Next, we will drift into the story of Baucis and Philemon, the elderly couple whose patience, kindness, and quiet humility allow them to survive divine tests and transform into enduring symbols of gentle, reflective love.